Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, I'm so glad you found your way back here this evening. Imagine discovering you were pregnant in the 1800s. There was no ultrasound to tell you what was happening inside your body. No reliable pain relief waiting at a hospital. No antibiotics if an infection appeared. And in many places, even a doctor might be hours or days away. Pregnancy was not simply a period of waiting for a baby. For many women, it meant continuing household work while dealing with exhaustion, nausea, pain, and the physical demands of carrying a child. And when labor finally arrived, there were few of the medical safeguards we take for granted today. Yet women did not face pregnancy completely alone. Midwives, mothers, neighbors, and generations of traditional knowledge played an important role. Some practices were surprisingly sensible. Others were based on beliefs that seem strange to us now. Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we're going back to the 1800s to quietly explore what pregnancy, childbirth, and everyday life were really like for women of the time. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's step into the past. Please, get comfortable. Pull that blanket up a little higher around you, and dim the lamp beside your bed if you can. Settle in, because our destination tonight isn't filled with ghosts or monsters. Instead, we're heading somewhere quieter, and perhaps a little harder to face. This is a real story. It happened to your very own great-great-grandmothers, and I'd wager no one ever told you the full truth of it. There's something that seldom gets mentioned about the 1800s. For a woman then, the most perilous day of her life wasn't a battle, or a sickness, or even old age. It was the day she brought a new life into the world. In some homes, doctors would discreetly suggest that young wives set their affairs in order before labor began, not for dramatic effect, but because the odds, more than anyone liked to admit, often pointed toward the worst. Now, before we step into the story, let's take care of each other for a moment. If you enjoy these quiet journeys with me, a simple tap on the screen means the world. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who loves history as much as you clearly do. And you know, I'm curious tonight. Where in the world are you right now? What time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I truly read every single one. And I love imagining all of you in different corners of the globe, unwinding together over the same story. Alright, turn the lamp down a touch more if you can. If you have a fan or a soft background hum, now is the perfect time to switch it on. Get cozy, and when you're ready, let's wander back in time together. Picture a modest farmhouse in New England, late in the year 1846. Rain patters gently against the window panes. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, a young wife sits with one hand resting on her belly, feeling something she can't quite explain to anyone yet. A flutter, faint as a moth tapping against the glass. She's going to have a child, and in that same moment of joy, something else slips in beside it. Fear, a quiet, unspoken fear that doesn't shout but simply waits in the corner of the room. She has no doctor to confirm the news, no test, no gentle machine that lets her hear a heartbeat weeks early. Just her own body and her careful counting of the days. For most of history, in fact, a pregnancy wasn't considered fully real, not by law or the church, until what people called quickening. That first moment she feels the baby move, sometimes a full 4 months in. Before that flutter, officially, there was nothing there at all. After it, a whole new set of rules takes over her daily life, whether she agrees with them or not. Loosen the corset, but never fully set it aside. Avoid being badly frightened, because everyone believes a fright can mark the child. Leave some invisible stain that follows it for life. Crave certain foods, avoid others. All according to wisdom passed down from her mother and grandmother before her. None of it written in any book, all of it treated as law, Because becoming a mother in that century was never only a matter of love and hope. It was, without exaggeration, one of the riskiest things a woman could do with her own body. When her time finally comes, there will be no hospital bed, no monitor beeping steadily beside her. There will be a midwife with rough, capable hands, a kettle of boiling water, a stack of clean linen torn into strips, and maybe a leather strap for her to bite down on. For there is nothing, absolutely nothing, waiting on the other side of that pain. She may labor for 1 hour. She may labor for 2 full days. And everyone in that house knows, without ever saying it out loud, that not every mother in the story gets to walk away. Historians studying birth records from that decade found that for roughly every 200 births, one mother did not survive. In the era's busiest maternity hospitals, the odds turned even darker. At one closely studied hospital in Vienna, records show that 1 birth in every 8 ended with a mother's death. Word of that number traveled fast, and it traveled to where you'd least expect it, straight into the fear of pregnant women themselves. Some of them, in the final weeks before their due date, chose to give birth on the street outside that hospital rather than walk through its doors. A cobblestone alley, they decided, gave their child better odds than a bed inside a building full of the era's most respected doctors. Let that sink in for a moment. It's almost impossible to believe. Giving birth outdoors, alone, unwashed, with nothing but instinct, was in the eyes of those terrified women the safer choice. Why on earth would that be true? Because those same physicians, in their long dark coats, would often walk straight from performing an autopsy to delivering a baby without ever once washing their hands. Nobody understood germs yet. Nobody had connected the invisible residue on a doctor's fingers to the raging fever that would seize a new mother just days after birth. A fever doctors solemnly called childbed fever, and families simply called a tragedy. A young physician working in that very hospital, a man named Ignaz Semmelweis, could not let the mystery rest. He noticed something strange. The ward staffed by medical students and doctors, fresh from the autopsy room each morning, buried far more mothers than the ward next door, staffed only by midwives who had never touched a corpse. His answer was almost embarrassingly simple. Wash your hands, he told his colleagues, in a solution of chlorinated lime before you ever touch a patient. Just that, and it worked. Death rates in his ward reportedly fell from around 18% down to a little over 1% in a matter of months. Thousands of mothers who would have died were instead walking home with their babies. You would think they would have carried him through the streets on their shoulders. Instead, his fellow physicians were furious. The idea that they, gentlemen of science, might be the ones carrying death on their own hands was, to them, offensive beyond words. They mocked him openly. They pushed him out of his own hospital. Dr. Semmelweis spent the rest of his life trying and failing to make anyone in power listen. And it slowly broke something in him. In 1865, at only 47 years old, he died alone and forgotten inside an asylum in circumstances still disputed by historians. What is not disputed is the cause of death recorded by the doctors who examined his body afterward. Blood poisoning, an infected wound. The very same enemy he had spent his whole career trying to warn the world about, finally and mercilessly catching up with him. So that as the world, our young mother-to-be back in that New England farmhouse was stepping into, no painkillers waiting for her at the end of those long hours of labor. No understanding of infection. Not yet. Not really. Not where it mattered. Just a midwife, a prayer, maybe a swallow of whiskey if the family could spare it. And a husband pacing somewhere outside the room, useless and fully aware of it, wearing that same look husbands have worn for centuries. Pure, helpless panic, hovering by the door like he might actually turn out to be useful. But something somewhere was about to shift. Not everywhere and not overnight, just somewhere. Across Massachusetts, in a quiet university town called Cambridge, A poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was about to become a father for the third time. His wife Fanny was due any day, and Henry, unlike most husbands of his era, had been paying very careful attention to news arriving from only a few miles away, from a hospital in Boston. The autumn before, in October of 1846, a dentist in that same city had done something almost theatrical. In front of a room full of doubtful surgeons, he had a patient breathe in the vapor of a substance called ether, and then calmly, painlessly, cut a tumor from the man's neck while the patient lay peacefully unconscious. The room understandably lost its composure. Word of it spread across the entire country within weeks. Here's a funny part though. Young men had actually been inhaling ether for fun at parties for years before that, laughing, stumbling, having a grand old time with absolutely no medical purpose in mind whatsoever. It took a while for anyone serious to look at that same substance and think, wait a moment, could this stop pain during surgery? Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in medicine start out looking like nothing more than a party trick. Henry Longfellow wanted that same mercy for his wife. But when he asked around, one physician after another turned him down flat. Using a substance built for surgery on a woman going through ordinary childbirth struck many of them as unnatural. Religious leaders went even further, pointing straight to a single verse from the book of Genesis, the line where Eve is told she will bring forth children in sorrow. To many of them, that sorrow was not just a figure of speech. It was a sentence handed down by a higher power, and no doctor had any business trying to soften it. Over in Scotland, that very same year, a physician named James Young Simpson, who had just discovered chloroform's effect on pain, spent months writing pamphlets right back at his critics, arguing in careful, patient detail that the original word translated as sorrow never meant physical pain to begin with. It became a real argument, fought out in newspapers and church pulpits alike, years before Fanny Longfellow ever breathed in that first dose of ether. So Henry did something almost stubborn in its devotion. He turned instead to a dentist, a man named Dr. Nathan Cooley Keep, who had real hands-on experience with ether, and asked him to be there for Fanny's delivery instead of any physician in the city. On the 7th of April, 1847, in a quiet bedroom in Cambridge, Fanny Appleton Longfellow breathed in the vapor of ether and gave birth to a healthy daughter, feeling almost none of the agony that had haunted every mother before her. She became the first woman in America known to give birth this way. Afterward, in her own words, she said she felt proud to be a pioneer for less suffering. 6 years later, an ocean away, that same idea reached the highest household in the world. Queen Victoria of England, giving birth to her 8th child, allowed her doctor to administer chloroform, a chemical cousin of ether. And just like that, in one single afternoon, centuries of religious and medical objection to pain relief in childbirth quietly evaporated. If it was good enough for a queen, who exactly was left to argue? And yet, here is the part of the story that never quite gets its happy ending. Pain relief spread, but infection did not disappear. Childbed fever kept right on killing mothers for decades after Fanny's peaceful birth. Long after Semmelweis had already handed the world the answer, and long after the world had already thrown that answer away and buried the man along with it, it would take the discovery of actual germs, tiny creatures nobody could even see, before doctors finally truly understood what was killing so many young mothers in that overheated room after labor. So the next time you picture a woman getting the news that she's expecting, somewhere back in the 1800s, try holding both feelings at once the way she had to. Joy, real and warm. And underneath it, a fear she rarely spoke aloud, because the very same bed where she brought a new life into the world could just as easily become the place where her own story ended. And if she survives, if she turns out to be one of the fortunate ones, her life does not simply return to normal the next morning. For weeks afterward, she's expected to stay indoors, resting in a darkened room in what people of that time called her lying-in. Neighbors and relatives take turns visiting, bringing her a warm, spiced drink called cordial, sitting with her so she's never quite left alone. And when those weeks are finally over, in towns across both America and Europe, she's often expected to attend a small church service, sometimes called churching, a formal thanksgiving for having survived. And depending on who you ask, a quiet ritual for being welcomed back into ordinary life at all. Even her recovery, in other words, belongs to everyone but her. And here is the strange, almost cruel little twist buried underneath all of this. Surviving the birth itself was never really the finish line for a woman like her, because on the very same day she agreed to marry, long before she ever became a mother at all, something else about her had already quietly disappeared. Not her body this time. Something written into the law itself the moment she said two simple words at the altar. Words that, without her even realizing it, made a part of her disappear completely. That word disappear is not some poetic exaggeration on my part. It was in a very real sense the actual law of the land, written into legal textbooks in plain, cold language. Lawyers even had a name for it. The moment a woman married, she stopped being what the courts called a femme sole, a woman standing alone under the law, and became instead a femme covert, a covered woman covered by her husband, folded into him. Legally speaking, the way a small stream disappears into a larger river and simply stops having its own name. Here is how one of the era's most famous legal scholars, an Englishman named William Blackstone, described it in a set of commentaries that shaped law on both sides of the Atlantic for generations. By marriage, he wrote, husband and wife become one person, and that person is the husband. Slow down over that sentence for a second, and it stops sounding like clever wordplay and starts sounding like something out of a magic trick, except nothing about it was an illusion. A married woman could not own property in her own name. She could not sign a binding contract. If she worked, and plenty of poor women had no choice but to work, her wages belonged by law to her husband, whether he ever showed up at the mill gate to collect them or not. If a father left his married daughter money in his will, that money passed through her hands and straight into her husband's, sometimes without her ever touching it at all. Let me put that another way, because it is worth sitting with for a moment. Picture working a 12-hour shift at a textile mill, coming home exhausted, and technically, under the law, never once having earned a single coin of your own pay. Picture, too, a widow inheriting her father's farm outright, running it competently for years on her own, and then losing every ounce of that independence the moment she remarried, because a second husband absorbed what a first one never even had the chance to touch. The system did not ask whether a woman was capable. Capability was never really the question it was built to answer. Now, I want to introduce you to a woman who ran straight into the sharpest edge of the system, not in a factory but in a courtroom. Her name was Myra Bradwell, and by 1869, she had trained in law for years, studying alongside her husband, running one of the most respected legal newspapers in the entire country. And she sat for the Illinois bar examination and passed it with real distinction. On paper, she had every qualification a lawyer needed, and the Illinois Supreme Court turned her down anyway. Their reasoning was almost breathtaking in its circular logic. A lawyer, they said, needs to be able to enter binding contracts with clients. A married woman, under the very same law that governed her entire existence, could not enter a binding contract at all. So the very institution of marriage that society pushed her toward her whole life became the legal excuse for keeping her out of a courtroom. Bradwell refused to let it rest there. She took her case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1873, and she lost 8 votes to 1. One of the concurring justices, a man named Joseph Bradley, went out of his way to explain exactly why, and his words are still taught in law schools today, usually as a case study in how confidently a powerful person can be wrong. Women, he argued, possessed what he called a natural and proper timidity, unsuited to the demands of civil life. Their true calling, he wrote, was what he described as the paramount destiny and mission of a wife and mother. And he called this, without a hint of doubt, the law of the Creator. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you had spent years training for a career, passed every exam put in front of you, and were told no, not because of your ability, but because of a sentence a judge believed he had heard straight from the mind of God, what would you have done with that anger? Myra Bradwell, for her part, did not fold. She kept publishing her legal newspaper. She kept writing model legislation. And in an odd twist of history, some of the very state laws she had already helped draft years earlier, laws expanding property rights for married women, were slowly chipping away at the very system that had just humiliated her in front of the country's highest court. While her own appeal was still working its way through the courts, she and her husband helped 2 other Illinois women write the exact bill that would have let her practice law in the first place. A bill banning sex discrimination in any occupation across the entire state. It passed in 1872. Bradwell, out of sheer stubborn pride, refused to reapply. She had already met every requirement once, she said, and she was not about to beg a second time. It took nearly 2 more decades, until 1890, before the Illinois Supreme Court finally admitted her on its own initiative, backdating the paperwork all the way to her original application. 2 years after that, the United States Supreme Court, the very body that had ruled against her, did the same. She had, by then, roughly 2 years left in her own life. Justice in her case did eventually arrive. It simply took 21 years to find the address. Because here's the thing about 1848. The same year that legal reasoning would later be used against Bradwell was actually starting to crack. In a small town called Seneca Falls in the state of New York, a gathering of a few hundred people met in a Methodist chapel to talk openly about exactly the kind of legal disappearance we've been discussing. A young woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood up and delivered aloud a document she had spent weeks drafting, one modeled deliberately, almost defiantly, on the Declaration of Independence itself. Where that older document had listed grievances against a king, Stanton's listed grievances against an entire legal system built around husbands. One line from that document has survived, quoted in textbooks and speeches ever since, and it is worth hearing exactly as she wrote it. She said the law had made a married woman, in her words, civilly dead. 2 words, civilly dead. Not physically, of course. She could still walk down the street, still raise her children, still run a household with more skill than most men of the era could ever manage. But in the eyes of every court in the land, she simply was not there. Now, that same year, something entirely practical happened just a short distance away, and I think it deserves a more honest telling than it usually gets. New York passed what became known as the Married Women's Property Act, allowing a wife to keep property she had owned before marriage safely in her own name. It gets remembered, understandably, as a triumph for women's rights, and in some sense it truly was. But if you dig into why lawmakers actually voted for it, the picture gets a little less romantic. The country had just come through a brutal economic collapse a decade earlier, one that wiped out countless family fortunes overnight. Wealthy fathers were growing nervous about handing land and money to a daughter only to watch her husband's failed business or his creditors swallow it whole. In other words, the law protecting a wife's property was, in no small part, a law protecting a father's investment. Women's rights and men's financial anxiety happened to be walking in the same direction that year, and history tends to remember only one of those 2 travelers. It is worth noting, too, that coverture was never quite as simple as total, unbroken erasure. And I think the honest version of this story has to include that complication. Common law did carry one small built-in safety net for widows, something called dower, a right guaranteeing a woman roughly a third of her late husband's estate for the remainder of her own life, whether his will mention her or not. On paper, that sounds almost generous. In practice, It reveals exactly how the whole system actually thought about a wife. Dower did not treat her as an owner. It treated her as a dependent who needed to be kept fed and housed after the man supporting her was gone. The same legal instinct you might use to protect a minor child or an aging parent rather than an equal partner in the marriage that had just ended. There was one other workaround, though it belonged almost exclusively to families with real money. Wealthy fathers, worried about handing a daughter's inheritance to a son-in-law they did not fully trust, could pay a lawyer to set up what courts of equity called a separate estate, a kind of legal trust that discreetly shielded her property from her husband's reach decades before any state legislature got around to writing similar protection into ordinary law. It worked for those who could afford it. A farmer's daughter in rural Ohio had no such option. Her only lawyer was whatever protection an actual statute eventually offered her. And for most of a century, no statute existed at all. Justice, it turns out, has always had a price tag attached, even when the courtroom pretended otherwise. Across the ocean, Britain took its own slower path toward a similar destination. In 1870, Parliament passed a Married Women's Property Act, though it turned out to be a fairly cautious first step, protecting only a wife's own earnings and a narrow category of investments, leaving most of the old rules still intact underneath it. It took a second, far more thorough act in 1882 to finally allow a married woman across England to hold property of any kind as her sole and separate owner, in the same way an unmarried woman always could. It had taken more than 3 decades after Stanton stood up in that Methodist chapel for the law to fully catch up with what she had already named out loud. Here is a strange little wrinkle worth pausing on, because I think it says something honest about how the whole system was built. If a man broke off an engagement before the wedding ever happened, a woman could sue him. And courts, on both sides of the Atlantic, sided with her almost automatically, treating a broken engagement as a broken contract worth real money in damages. Which raises an odd question, doesn't it? The law was, in a strange way, more protective of her the moment before she married than at any point after. And once you notice that pattern, the reason behind it stops feeling like much of a mystery. Before the wedding, she was still, legally speaking, her own person, a party capable of being wronged and compensated like anyone else. The instant she said her vows, that same legal personhood was the thing she gave away. And property was really only the visible half of the problem. The quieter half lived inside the household itself, where the law had almost nothing at all to say. A husband held broad, largely unquestioned authority over decisions concerning his wife and children. And if that authority turned cruel behind closed doors, a woman's legal options were painfully thin. She could not easily sue him. In most places, she could not simply pack a bag and walk away without losing access to her own children in the process. Courts in this era regularly described the home as a private sphere. The law preferred not to enter, which sounds neutral enough on paper, until you realize what that phrase actually meant for the person with the least power inside that home. Marriage vows in that century included the promise to obey, and that word was not decorative. Courts occasionally leaned on it quite literally as legal justification. Would you have signed a contract like that, knowing exactly what it meant if somebody had actually explained the fine print to you beforehand? Most brides in the 1800s were never given the chance to ask. I will say this gently because I think it matters. It is tempting, looking back from where we sit tonight, to imagine people in the 1800s as somehow less aware of the unfairness than we are now. They were not. Women wrote about it constantly in private letters, in diaries, in petitions to legislatures that mostly ignored them. The unfairness was obvious to the people living inside it. What was missing was not awareness. It was power. Even the language of the wedding itself carried a strange little irony, if you think about it. Till death do us part. A phrase meant to sound romantic, permanent, devoted. And for a married woman under coverture, It was also quite literally an accurate legal description of exactly how long her separate existence would remain suspended. Death, or an act of parliament, or a legislature somewhere finally catching up. Those were, for a long stretch of the 1800s, more or less her only two ways out. And here is the part that tends to truly surprise people, so let me leave you with it before we move on. This was not some ancient injustice sealed away in a dusty history book, finished and forgotten generations ago. In many places across the United States, a married woman could not open a credit card in her own name, could not get a loan without her husband's signature standing right beside hers, until a law changed that in 1974. Not 1874, 1974. Somewhere out there tonight, there is very likely a grandmother or a great aunt who remembers exactly what that felt like, because she lived through the tail end of it herself. She may have stood at a bank counter, filled out every form correctly, and still been asked for a husband's signature before anyone would take her seriously as a borrower. Coverture, formal legal doctrine, had been dead for generations by then. Its habits of mind clearly took a great deal longer to actually leave the building. So when this young wife we have been following, and the countless real women whose names never made it into any law book at all, walked toward marriage in the 1800s, she was not simply choosing a husband. She was quietly signing away a version of herself that the law would not hand back for a very long time. It is easy, from where we sit tonight, to imagine that story ending right there at the altar, as though the danger had already peaked and the rest was simply endurance. It had not, because once that new chapter of her life began in earnest, once children started arriving in that household one after another, an entirely different danger was waiting for her. And this one did not come from a judge, or a husband, or a courtroom at all. It came from something far smaller, sitting on a shelf in the very room where her children slept. In a small glass bottle with a friendly label and a spoon resting beside it, and a disturbing amount of opium calmly dissolved inside. That small glass bottle waiting on the shelf had a name, and for an unsettling number of families in the 1800s, it was a name they trusted completely. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. First sold in 1849, invented by an actual nurse named Charlotte Winslow, and then turned into a fortune by her son-in-law and his business partner, a pair of druggists working out of a small operation in Bangor, Maine. The label showed a plump, glowing, perfectly peaceful baby cradled in a mother's arms, which, considering what was actually inside the bottle, might be one of the darkest pieces of advertising ever printed. Every ounce of that syrup carried around 65 milligrams of morphine dissolved into a base of plain grain alcohol. One full teaspoon held enough of the drug to end an infant's life. And parents were giving it quite literally on purpose, spooning it straight into a small, open mouth with the same casual confidence you might use pouring out a dose of children's cough syrup today. It was marketed for teething, for colic, for a fussy baby who simply would not stop crying at 2 in the morning. And it worked exactly as advertised. The baby went quiet. The baby slept. What the label never mentioned was how many of those babies never woke back up. Nobody kept a clean official count, because nobody at the time understood what was happening. When an infant slipped away in their sleep after a dose of the syrup, doctors wrote down causes that sounded scientific enough to satisfy a grieving family. Convulsions, cholera, and phantom congestion of the brain. By 1868, court records show the company selling roughly 1.5 million bottles a year. Do the math on that for a moment, across decades of sales, and you start to understand why medical historians still describe this one product as responsible for an untold number of quiet, unexplained deaths in nurseries across 2 entire countries. And here is the part that turns this from one bad product into an entire era's blind spot. Cross the Atlantic to England, and you would find working mothers reaching for their own version of the exact same thing. A mixture called Godfrey's Cordial, opium blended with treacle and water, sold under a nickname that tells you everything you need to know about why people bought it. Druggists simply called it quietness. One shop owner in Manchester later admitted, almost casually, to selling half a gallon of the leading brand and several more gallons of a cheaper copy every single week to mothers who needed to leave a baby safely asleep while they worked a 12-hour shift in a nearby mill. This was never one isolated, badly run company exploiting parents. It was two entire nations on opposite sides of an ocean, independently arriving at the exact same terrible solution to the exact same exhausting problem. A baby who would not stop crying, and a parent who had absolutely nowhere else to turn. Knowing what we know now, does that make the whole situation feel less like carelessness and more like a system that had quietly failed everyone involved, parents and children alike, long before any single bottle was ever uncorked? Here is a question worth turning over in your mind for a second. If your own grandmother or great-grandmother had reached for a spoon of that syrup on a hard night, calmly, lovingly, with absolutely no idea what she was actually giving her child, would you even be able to blame her for it? Because that is really the heart of this. Nobody involved thought of themselves as doing anything wrong. And once you understand that, the story stops being about villains and starts being about something far more unsettling. An entire century where good, loving, exhausted parents were operating almost completely. Let me widen the lens for a moment, because Mrs. Winslow's syrup, as dangerous as it was really only one small piece of a much larger picture. Simply being born into the 1800s was, statistically speaking, a remarkably dangerous proposition. In London during this era, roughly 150 out of every 1,000 babies born died before their first birthday. Cross the ocean into New York City, and that number climbed even higher, closer to 170 out of every 1,000. Head out to the quiet farmland of Vermont, away from crowded tenements and open sewers, and the number dropped to around 100, which still means 1 out of every 10 babies born in the peaceful countryside did not survive their first year of life. Sit with that contrast for a second, because it tells you something the syrup alone cannot. The danger was not evenly spread. It clustered wherever people were packed closely together, wherever clean water was scarce, wherever a growing industrial city outpaced its own ability to deal with human waste and crowding. Poverty and density were, in their own quiet way, every bit as dangerous as anything sold in a glass bottle. There was another danger, too, born from nothing more sinister than exhaustion and a lack of space. Poor families frequently shared a single bed, parents and infant together, simply because there was no room and no money for anything else. A coroner in London, reviewing the records for just 10 months in the late 1880s, counted 500 cases in the city alone where a sleeping infant had been accidentally smothered by a parent rolling over them in the night. He believed, based on everything crossing his desk, that roughly 1 death in every 3 officially labeled an accident actually belonged to this quiet, entirely unintentional category. Nobody meant harm. Everybody was simply too tired in too small a room for the exhaustion of raising a family in poverty to ever really be safe. Now, here's where the story gets truly strange. And I promise you this next part is true, strange as it sounds. In 1839 alone, official government registrars in England and Wales recorded teething, the simple, ordinary act of a baby's first teeth pushing through their gums, as the direct cause of death in just over 5,000 cases. 5,000, not as a contributing factor, as the actual listed cause on an official death certificate. Doctors of the era were not lying, and they were not careless. They were making a mistake that is almost painfully human once you understand it. They noticed that babies tended to die, most often right around the exact age when teeth were coming in, and they concluded, quite reasonably from where they stood, that one thing was causing the other. What they had actually stumbled onto was a coincidence of timing, not a cause. That same stretch of infancy also happens to be exactly when a baby's inherited protection from its mother fades away, when many families stop nursing and switch to unclean bottled milk, and when a crawling, exploring infant first starts putting absolutely everything within reach directly into their mouth. Teething did not kill those children. Everything happening around teething did. And because nobody could see bacteria, nobody could see that connection either. The treatments that followed from this mistaken belief were sometimes almost as dangerous as the disease itself, including, in some medical texts of the era, actually lancing a baby's gums with a blade to help a tooth along. A procedure that occasionally introduced the very infection it was meant to prevent. Modern pediatric medicine has since settled the question completely. Teething causes mild discomfort, a little drooling, maybe a slightly raised temperature at most. It does not cause seizures. It does not cause fatal fevers. It does not kill children. And it never did. But it took roughly a full century of watching, and eventually a proper understanding of germs, before anyone could say that with real confidence. In the meantime, thousands of death certificates carried a cause of death that, in hindsight, explained absolutely nothing at all. I want to pause here and introduce you to a family that had every possible advantage this century could offer, and still could not outrun what we've just been describing. Charles Darwin, a man whose name would eventually become inseparable from the entire idea of scientific reasoning itself, had 10 children with his wife Emma. He adored them, worried over their health constantly, and had, by any measure of his era, access to the very best medical advice that money could arrange. In the spring of 1851, his favorite child, a bright, affectionate 10-year-old daughter named Annie, fell seriously ill. Darwin took her to a spa town called Malvern for a fashionable treatment of the day. Cold water baths, brisk walks, fresh country air, hoping the regimen might restore her the way it had briefly seemed to help his own chronic illness. It did not. Annie grew steadily worse over the following month, and she died that April, most likely from tuberculosis, though the physician attending her simply recorded the cause as bilious fever. Darwin was, by every account from people who knew him, never quite the same afterward. He sat down and wrote a private memorial of her, just for himself and Emma, describing the small, ordinary things he missed most, the way she used to smooth his hair, the careful little scraps of paper she cut and saved. He kept a small wooden box of her belongings for the rest of his own life. Many historians studying his letters believe her death played a real part in the quiet unraveling of his religious faith. If the sharpest scientific mind of the entire century could not save his own daughter with every resource available to him, what possible chance did an ordinary family have? There is another layer to this story worth knowing about, one that rarely makes it into the softer, more sentimental versions of Victorian family life. Wealthier households in this period commonly hired a wet nurse, another woman, often quite poor herself, paid to breastfeed and care for a baby that was not her own. It was such an established custom that entire employment agencies existed just to match nursing mothers with families who could afford the fee. And a healthy young wet nurse with good references could sometimes earn more in a year than a farm laborer. For many families, this was simple, unremarkable practicality, but an entire secondary industry grew up around the arrangement, one considerably darker than a comfortable nursery scene. Poor, unmarried mothers, desperate and without support, sometimes paid a stranger a single lump sum to take a baby permanently off their hands. The women who accepted these babies were paid once, not monthly, which meant, in the coldest possible arithmetic, that a baby who did not survive very long actually cost less to care for than one who did. Historians refer to this practice today as baby farming. And while most of the women involved were simply poor and overwhelmed themselves, doing their genuine best in an impossible situation, the incentive structure quietly built into the whole arrangement was, without question, capable of terrible things. A handful of especially shocking criminal trials in the early 1870s finally forced the British government to act, and Parliament passed the Infant Life Protection Act in 1872, requiring anyone caring for more than one infant under a year old for payment to register with local authorities. It was a start, though a fairly modest one. The law had no real teeth for decades afterward, and it would take several more rounds of legislation, spread out across the rest of the century, before oversight of paid infant care in Britain resembled genuine protection in any meaningful sense. On a gentler note, grief itself looked different in this century, and I think it deserves a moment of real understanding rather than simple shock. Photography was still new and expensive in the 1800s, often too costly to justify for an ordinary family portrait during a child's short life. But when that child died, many parents scraped together the money for exactly one photograph taken after death. The child dressed carefully, sometimes posed among siblings, eyes occasionally painted open afterward by hand. Some families went further still, saving a small lock of the child's hair and having it woven by a professional jeweler into a mourning ring or a brooch meant to be worn every single day. It looks unsettling to modern eyes, and I understand completely why, but try just for a moment to see it the way a grieving mother in 1860 might have seen it. It was very often the only image that would ever exist of her child's face. Not a strange ritual around death, a desperate, loving act of remembrance performed by a parent who had absolutely nothing else left to hold on to. Would you have done anything differently in her position, with no camera, no recording, nothing but memory to prove that a particular small person had once existed in the world at all? What strikes me most, working through all of this, is not really the scale of the numbers, staggering as they were. It is how ordinary the grief must have felt, sitting right alongside how completely devastating it also was. A mother in this era might bury 2 or 3 children and still be expected to run a household, smile for neighbors, carry on. Common did not mean easy. It only meant that nobody around her had the luxury of treating her loss as unusual. We tend, from a safe distance of a century and a half, to imagine the past as somehow tougher, more hardened to death than we are now. I do not think that is quite right. I think the people living through it simply had no other choice but to keep going and mistook their own endurance, understandably, for something closer to acceptance. So if a child in this century somehow made it past the syrup, past the fevers, past the crowded, unsanitary years of infancy that swallowed so many others whole, they had, in a very real sense, already survived the hardest statistical stretch of their entire life. Their mother might reasonably have allowed herself a small, quiet exhale at that point, a sense that the worst of it was finally truly behind her. She would have been wrong. Surviving infancy brought a child nothing resembling safety. It simply changed the shape of the danger waiting for them, and traded one set of threats for another, considerably louder and far more mechanical. Because the moment that child could stand upright, walk on their own, and follow a simple instruction without stumbling, an entirely different adult world was already preparing to put them to work in places considerably darker and louder than any nursery, standing beside machinery that had absolutely no interest in whether the small hands operating it belonged to a child of 5 or 6 or 7 years old. Picture this particular machine for a second, the one waiting at the end of infancy. It did not care whether the hands feeding it belonged to a grown man or a 7-year-old girl. It simply ran hour after hour, day after day, and expected everyone standing near it to keep pace or get out of the way. No factory whistle ever slowed down out of consideration for how small a worker happened to be. Let's start underground, because that is where the youngest of them went first, before sunrise, before most of us have even finished our first coffee. In coal pits across Britain, a job called trapping was often the very first job handed to a child, sometimes no older than 5 or 6. A trapper sat alone in a narrow, carved-out space beside a wooden door, deep in the pitch dark, opening it every time a coal cart needed to pass through, and pulling it shut again the instant it did, keeping the mine's air flowing correctly through the tunnels. For 10, 12 hours at a stretch, alone in the dark. A government investigator sent underground in 1842 to record exactly what these children experienced sat down with a small girl named Sarah Gooder, 8 years old, working a pit called Gower. Her actual words were written down and preserved. "I'm scared," she told him, "of trapping without a light. I never go to sleep. I don't like being in the pit." Sit with that phrase for a moment. 8 years old. And she'd already learned entirely on her own exactly how much darkness a person can endure before it stops feeling ordinary and starts feeling like something to be afraid of. Notice too what Sarah actually said she wanted instead. Not rescue in any dramatic sense, simply school. A great many working children of this era never learned their letters at all. And the ones who did, like Sarah, usually managed it in a single scrap of borrowed time on a Sunday, squeezed between 6 days of physical labor. Reformers pushing for shorter hours in mines and mills often framed their argument less around cruelty and more around this exact point, that a nation quietly raising an entire generation unable to make sense of its own newspapers was storing up a much larger problem for itself down the road. Older children in the same mines carried the coal itself, hauling loaded carts strapped to their bodies through tunnels sometimes barely 3 feet high, on their hands and knees. That same parliamentary investigation recorded a 12-year-old named Isabella Reed, working to support her mother after her father's death, making roughly 25 to 30 trips a day from the coal face to the surface, dragging nearly 125 pounds behind her each time. 12 years old. That is heavier than most adult men could comfortably carry today. And she did it repeatedly, underground, in the dark, before most of us would even be trusted to walk to school alone. Another girl interviewed by that same commission, 17-year-old Patience Kershaw, worked what the pits called a hurrier, pulling a loaded coal wagon by a chain and belt strapped around her waist, on her hands and knees, covering nearly 20 miles underground across a single 12-hour shift. She told the investigator plainly, and without any apparent self-pity, that the men she worked for beat her with their hands across her back whenever she moved too slowly, and that she would rather have worked almost anywhere else, if anywhere else had actually been available to a girl in her position. The commissioner who recorded her testimony described her afterward in his own private notes with a startling lack of sympathy for a girl clearly worn down by forces entirely outside her control. History does not always remember its victims kindly, even in the very documents meant to help them. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment. If a child you love came home tonight and told you they had spent the day exactly the way Sarah or Isabella did, what is the very first thing you think you would do? The danger in these mines was not only exhaustion, it was catastrophic, sudden, and completely indifferent to age. On the 4th of July, 1838, in a Yorkshire pit called Husker, a violent summer storm dumped several inches of rain in under 2 hours. The flooding knocked out the steam engine that normally hauled workers back up to the surface. So word went down that everyone should simply wait at the bottom until it was repaired. Roughly 40 children, restless and frightened after already spending 9 hours underground, decided instead to try escaping through an old ventilation passage that led out to open woodland nearby. It should have worked. The stream feeding that passage had reportedly never once overflowed in living memory. But water was already rushing down it that afternoon, and it caught the children from behind, pinning 26 of them against a closed door they had no way to open, and drowning every single one where they stood. 11 girls, 15 boys. Their average age was 8.5. The youngest was only 7 years old. 14 others, slightly ahead of the group, made it through in time and raised the alarm above ground, which meant some parents spent that entire afternoon not knowing whether their own child was among the survivors or the drowned. The disaster shocked the entire country, reportedly including the young Queen Victoria herself, and it became one of the loudest arguments behind a new law passed just a few years later, banning women and boys under the age of 10 from working underground at all. Now, Coal mines were not the only place a small body was considered useful precisely because it was small. Step outside and up into the chimneys of London. Before mechanical brushes existed, the only reliable way to clean the soot from a narrow, twisting flue was to send a child directly up inside it, sometimes climbing barefoot and completely naked to keep their clothing from catching on brick and getting stuck. Some of these climbing boys, as they were called, were as young as 4 years old, small enough to wedge into spaces barely wider than their own shoulders. Master sweeps, according to multiple accounts from the period, would sometimes light a small fire of straw at the bottom of the flue to encourage a frightened or hesitant child to keep climbing upward, away from the smoke and heat rising behind them. The children were routinely bruised, scraped raw, occasionally burned by chimneys that had not fully cooled, and in the worst documented cases, they suffocated or became lodged so tightly that they could not be pulled free at all. Here is the part of this story that truly surprised me the first time I came across it, and I think it deserves real credit as one of the strangest, most quietly important discoveries in the entire history of medicine. In 1775, a London surgeon named Percival Pott began noticing an unusual pattern among a small group of his older patients, all men who had spent their childhood working as chimney sweeps. They kept developing a rare, painful form of cancer. And Pott, through careful observation rather than any laboratory test science did not yet possess, correctly linked it to years of soot trapped against their skin. It was the first time in recorded medical history that any doctor had proven a cancer could be caused by something in a person's environment, rather than some inherited flaw in the body itself. A child sent up a chimney in 1770 could not have known that the very act was quietly writing a death sentence to be collected 30 years later. Parliament responded, eventually setting a minimum age of 8 for the trade in 1788, though enforcement remained weak enough that boys younger than that kept climbing anyway for decades afterward. Textile mills carried their own particular danger, one built directly into the machinery itself. Young children, small enough to duck beneath a running loom, were hired specifically as piecers and scavengers, sent crawling underneath massive spinning frames while the machines stayed fully powered and moving, to tie off broken threads or clear away loose cotton fluff gathering on the floor. The machines were never switched off for this. Stopping and restarting a factory floor cost the owner money, and a small, nimble child was considered perfectly capable of working safely around moving iron, right up until the moment they were not. Fingers, hands, sometimes an entire arm, were lost this way with grim regularity, and mill owners simply treated it as an accepted cost of running a profitable operation. The noise alone, hundreds of mechanical looms hammering away in one enclosed room for 12 or 14 hours straight, was enough to permanently damage a child's hearing over time. Though nobody in that era was tracking that particular cost at all, I find myself wondering honestly what it must have done to a person to grow up measuring the danger of an ordinary workday in fingers rather than hours. Reform came slowly, and mostly because of pressure applied from outside the factories themselves, from reformers, doctors, and a small number of sympathetic members of Parliament willing to walk through a mill floor and actually watch what happened there. An 1833 law finally created paid government inspectors with real authority to walk into a British mill and check a child's age rather than trusting an owner's word for it. And it limited children under 13 to no more than 9 hours of work a day, which sounds shockingly modest until you remember it was an improvement. It was not perfect, inspectors were few, factories were many, and owners grew quite skilled at hiding their youngest workers whenever word arrived that an inspection was coming. Still, it was the first time the government had ever treated a child's safety on a factory floor as something worth actually verifying rather than simply hoping for. Now, if you're picturing all of this as strictly a British story, safely tucked away on the other side of an ocean, I want to gently correct that, because the pattern crossed the Atlantic almost perfectly intact, and in some ways lasted considerably longer once it landed. In the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania, Boys as young as 8 or 9 worked as what the industry called breaker boys, perched for 10 hours a day over a moving chute of crushed coal, picking out slate and rock by hand, with fingers that cracked and bled from the constant friction, breathing coal dust the entire time. Pennsylvania passed a law in 1885 banning anyone under 12 from this exact job. Coal companies largely ignored it, or simply had parents falsify a birth date, because a smaller worker still meant a lower wage, and a hungry family rarely had the leverage to argue. It took one stubborn former schoolteacher with a camera to really shift public opinion. A photographer named Lewis Hines spent roughly a decade, starting in 1908, traveling the country for an organization called the National Child Labor Committee, talking his way past foremen and factory guards, sometimes hiding his camera inside a lunch pail to document exactly what American child labor actually looked like. He photographed a 12-year-old spinner in Vermont named Addie Card, standing dwarfed beside a massive machine, and countless children just like her scattered across mills, canneries, coal breakers, and city streets from Georgia to Maine. Newsboys as young as 6 sold papers on freezing street corners well past midnight. Girls barely old enough for school shucked oysters in Gulf Coast canneries with knives sharp enough to slice their own fingers as easily as the shellfish. By 1910, children under the age of 15 made up roughly 18% of the entire American workforce. Hines' photographs, quiet and unglamorous and utterly damning, are widely credited with finally moving public opinion enough to force real legislation. Here is the detail I find particularly striking if you step back and compare the two countries side by side. Britain had already passed meaningful enforceable protections for working children by the 1840s. The United States did not pass a comprehensive federal law regulating child labor until 1938, with the Fair Labor Standards Act, nearly a full century later. Industrial progress and moral progress, it turns out, have never automatically traveled together. And sometimes the country that invented the assembly line was among the very last to agree that a child should not be operating one. Why the gap, you might reasonably ask. Part of the answer is simply geography and speed. Britain's mines and mills were tightly clustered, easy for a handful of government inspectors to actually visit and monitor. America was enormous. Its industry scattered across dozens of separate states, each writing its own rules or refusing to write any at all. And a federal government that spent decades treating child labor as a matter for individual states to sort out on their own, which in practice usually meant nobody sorted it out at all. I keep coming back to one particular thought while working through all of this. We tend to imagine childhood as something universal, something every era simply understood the same way we do now. It was not. For an enormous stretch of the 1800s, on both sides of the Atlantic, childhood itself was treated less like a protected stage of life and more like a temporary size advantage, useful for exactly as long as a body stayed small enough to fit somewhere an adult could not. Would things have moved faster? Do you think if the people writing these laws had ever once been required to spend a full week doing the work themselves? But even the children who survived the mine, the chimney, and the mill were, in a strange way, the fortunate ones because at least their feet stayed planted on solid ground, in a place their family could still find them at the end of a shift. For another group of boys in this same century, childhood ended somewhere far less traceable, dragged, sometimes quite literally against their will, straight off a city street and onto the deck of a ship bound for open water, where the ground itself, along with everything else that once felt solid and familiar, would never again be something they could fully trust. That ship, the one waiting at the end of a dark street rather than a mine shaft, rarely announced itself politely. For a great many young men along the coasts of Britain in the early 1800s, the sea did not arrive as a choice at all. It arrived as a gang of armed men, sometimes half drunk themselves, bursting into a tavern, a wedding, or a family's own front room, and simply taking whoever looked strong enough to pull a rope. A man might step outside for a breath of night air and wake up hours later below decks, his protest drowned out by the creak of timber and the shouting of officers who had never once asked his name. This was called impressment, and everybody along the waterfront simply called the men who carried it out the press gang. Britain's wars against Napoleon devoured sailors at a staggering rate. Between 1793 and 1812, the number of men needed to crew the Royal Navy nearly tripled, climbing from around 36,000 up to roughly 114,000. And voluntary enlistment never managed to fill that gap, because life below deck was brutal and the pay was miserable. So the Navy simply took what it needed. Historians estimate that as many as half of all the sailors serving the fleet during this period had not volunteered for a single day of it. One of Britain's own most celebrated admirals, Horatio Nelson, said the quiet part out loud in a letter, admitting plainly that without the press, he had no idea how the fleet could possibly be manned. That is not a rumor whispered by critics. That is the man in command of the entire operation acknowledging in writing that the system only worked because it was allowed to kidnap its own workforce. In fairness, it is worth saying plainly that Britain did not hold a monopoly on this particular cruelty. American naval officers, when it suited them, were documented boarding British vessels and pressing sailors of their own during roughly this same period, on a considerably smaller scale, but with the identical cold logic behind it. A desperate navy, whatever flag it happens to fly, tends to reach for whichever bodies are closest at hand. And here is where this story crosses directly into American history, because this was not simply Britain's own domestic quarrel. British ships routinely stopped American merchant vessels on the open ocean and boarded them, searching for supposed British deserters hiding among the crew. And the standard of proof required was, to put it generously, extremely loose. American sailors sometimes carried official protection papers, signed documents meant to certify their citizenship. But boarding officers frequently waved them aside as forgeries. Sometimes correctly, since a thriving black market in fake protection papers did exist. And sometimes not, which meant a genuine American citizen had almost no reliable way to prove who he actually was to a man who had already decided not to believe him. Roughly 10,000 men claiming American citizenship were swept up and forced into British naval service during this period. Sailors would produce paperwork, protest in their own accents, insist on their nationality, and frequently it did not matter in the slightest to the officers standing in front of them. This exact grievance became one of the direct causes of the War of 1812, a war fought partly over the simple, furious question of who actually owned a man's own body once he stepped onto the deck of a ship. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If armed strangers could legally walk into your home tonight and remove you for years of forced labor on nothing more than a suspicion about your accent, how long do you think your own country would tolerate that arrangement? Even setting the press gang aside entirely, an ordinary sailor's daily meal was its own small trial of endurance. The standard ration centered on a rock-hard biscuit called hardtack, baked dry enough to survive months at sea without spoiling, and salted meat preserved in brine so heavily that sailors joked it could outlast the ship itself. Both were reliably infested with weevils and small biscuit worms by the later weeks of any long voyage, and the accepted solution was not particularly reassuring. Tap the biscuit firmly on the table first so the insects fell out before you ate it in the dark if you preferred not to actually see them go. A daily ration of watered-down rum, called grog, helped mask the taste of everything else, and by more than one naval historian's estimate, quietly fueled the great majority of the very offenses that then earned men a flogging in the first place. Once aboard, whether pressed or truly willing, a sailor's body faced an entirely different enemy, one with no interest in nationality at all. For centuries, long ocean voyages had been silently stalked by a disease called scurvy, caused by something so simple it seems almost cruel in hindsight: a prolonged lack of vitamin C. It crept in slowly at first, a strange tiredness, joints that ache for no obvious reason. Then the gums began to bleed and blacken and pull away from the teeth. Old scars and broken bones, some healed for decades, would inexplicably reopen, as though the body itself had quietly forgotten how to hold anything together. Sailors grew exhausted, their teeth loosened in their jaws, and eventually, without treatment, they died, sometimes within sight of a coastline lined with the very fruit that could have saved them. In 1747, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind ran what many historians now consider one of the very first proper clinical trials in medical history, dividing 6 sailors into pairs and giving each pair a different remedy. Cider, vinegar, sea water, a mild acid, and for one lucky pair, 2 oranges and a lemon daily. The results were about as clear as scientific results ever get. The citrus pair recovered almost completely within days. Everyone else did not. You would expect the Royal Navy to have adopted citrus rations immediately. Instead, astonishingly, it took 48 more years. 48 years of entirely preventable suffering and death, while the cure sat published and available the entire time, before the Admiralty finally mandated a daily ration of lemon juice for every sailor in 1795. When it finally happened, scurvy reportedly vanished from Royal Navy ships almost overnight. A few years later, wartime shortages of Spanish lemons pushed the Navy toward limes grown in British Caribbean colonies instead, a switch that incidentally is exactly where the old nickname limey for a British sailor actually comes from. Now, if you assume the newly independent United States looked at this decades-long British embarrassment and simply learned the obvious lesson faster, I would gently push back on that assumption. As late as 1827, long after scurvy had become a rare curiosity aboard most European fleets, the American frigate Macedonian reported 101 deaths from scurvy among a crew of only 376 men over the course of a single 6-month voyage. More than a quarter of the entire crew lost to a disease with a known, published, decades-old cure sitting in plain sight the whole time. An American naval officer, Captain David Porter, had actually introduced lemon juice to his own crew as early as 1811. Proving the remedy worked perfectly well on this side of the ocean too. Yet it took the wider American Navy decades longer still to adopt anything resembling a consistent fleet-wide policy. Sometimes the lesson everyone else already learned takes an embarrassingly long time to actually cross an ocean, even when a countryman has already proven it works. Discipline aboard these ships carried its own particular terror, one that had nothing to do with weather or disease at all. The cat o' nine tails, a whip built from 9 knotted lengths of rope attached to a short wooden handle, was the standard instrument, and a captain could order a flogging for offenses as minor as a sloppy uniform or a slow response to an order. The whole ritual followed its own grim choreography. A boatswain's mate would call out for all hands to muster and witness punishment. The crew would gather in silence on deck, and the offending sailor was stripped to the waist and tied by his wrists to a wooden grating, facing outward, so that every man watching understood exactly what waited for him. 2. Should he ever slip, public humiliation was considered every bit as useful a deterrent as the physical pain itself. A serious court-martial offense could bring 100 lashes or more, enough, by multiple first-hand accounts of the period, to strip skin and muscle from a man's back well before the punishment even concluded, leaving him carried below by his own shipmates rather than walking there himself. What finally ended the practice in the American Navy was not, in the end, a change of heart among naval officers themselves. It was 2 books. A sailor named Richard Henry Dana Jr. published a memoir called 2 Years Before the Mast in 1840, describing the brutality he had personally witnessed at sea in plain, unglamorous language that ordinary readers on dry land could not easily dismiss. A decade later, a struggling young novelist named Herman Melville, years before anyone had ever heard of a certain white whale, published a similar account called White Jacket, drawn from his own time in the Navy. Between the two books and the public outrage they generated, petitions poured into Congress, over 270 of them arriving in Washington in a single 6-month stretch. And in 1850, by the narrowest possible margin in the Senate, a single handful of votes deciding the entire matter, flogging was formally abolished throughout the entire American Navy and Merchant Marine in one stroke. Funny enough, when the Navy asked its own officers directly in that same year whether flogging could safely be eliminated, the overwhelming majority said no. Reform in this particular case arrived over the objections of nearly everyone actually holding the whip. I find that detail worth sitting with for a second. It was not the officers who ended it. It was the writers and the ordinary readers who finally could not look away once the truth was printed plainly enough to reach them. Isolation, discipline, and suspicion could combine into something far darker than a flogging. And one incident from 1842 still stands as one of the strangest, most disputed stories in the entire history of the American Navy. A training brig called the Somers set sail that year, carrying a crew of mostly teenage apprentices meant to learn seamanship on a working voyage rather than sitting in a classroom. Among them was a 19-year-old midshipman named Philip Spencer, the son of the sitting Secretary of War. A young man with a well-documented taste for pirate stories and a troubled record already following him from ship to ship, having already been dismissed from 2 previous postings for drunkenness before his influential father quietly arranged yet another placement. Partway through the return voyage, an officer approached the ship's commander with an unsettling report that Spencer had been talking openly about mutiny, about killing the officers and turning the small brig into a pirate vessel on the high seas. A search reportedly turned up a list of names, written in Greek characters as though to disguise it, believed to identify crewmen sympathetic to the plot. With the ship still weeks from home, no telegraph, no radio, absolutely no way to consult a higher authority before making a decision, the commander convened his own officers in a hurried conference below decks. They declared Spencer and 2 other suspected conspirators guilty. And on the 1st of December, without any formal court-martial, without a judge, without a jury, all 3 men were hanged from the yardarm in front of the assembled crew. When the ship finally reached New York, the country erupted into fierce, bitter argument over whether the commander had prevented a genuine massacre at sea, or simply murdered a troubled teenager and 2 other men on nothing firmer than suspicion, rumor, and fear. The controversy burned hot enough and raised such serious questions about how young officers were actually being trained and supervised at sea that it became one of the direct arguments behind founding the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis just 3 years later. An attempt to replace exactly this kind of isolated, unsupervised life-or-death authority with something resembling formal education and oversight instead. Would you have trusted your own judgment alone on open water, with no one else to consult, enough to give that same order? Taken together, I think these stories say something larger about the entire century, not just about ships. An extraordinary amount of what we now consider basic human decency, protection from forced labor, a reliable diet, freedom from arbitrary brutal punishment, a fair hearing before facing execution, had to be fought for individually, industry by industry, ship by ship, often only after enough ordinary people were horrified enough by a book, a scandal, or a body count to finally demand something better. None of it arrived automatically simply because the century grew older. And none of it arrived because the men in charge woke up one morning with a sudden change of heart. It makes me wonder, honestly, how many of the things we now take entirely for granted, safety at work, a fair trial, basic dignity on the job, are actually only as permanent as the last generation willing to fight loudly enough to keep them. But sailors at least chose a life that offered some hope of eventually returning home to solid ground and a warm hearth, even if that hope was thin and the odds against it were considerable. For another group of young men in this same era, There was no ship to eventually make port. No voyage with an ending date circled hopefully on a calendar somewhere back home. There was only a battlefield, a uniform 2 sizes too large, and the quiet, growing understanding, learned by nearly every soldier who lived long enough to learn anything at all, that far more of them would die from disease and infection in a filthy field hospital than would ever fall to an enemy's bullet. That understanding did not arrive gently for most soldiers. It arrived the way most hard truths do in wartime, slowly, then all at once, usually somewhere between a field hospital tent reeking of chloroform and blood, and a shallow grave dug by exhausted men who had already dug several that same week, and would likely dig several more before nightfall. Let us start with a myth, because I think tearing one down properly is one of the most satisfying ways to actually learn something true. If you picture a Civil War amputation, there is a very good chance the image in your head involved a soldier biting down hard on a bullet, while a surgeon saws through bone with nothing else to dull the pain, sweat soaking his face as strong hands hold him still against the table. It is a vivid picture. It has shown up in more films and novels than I could count, passed down so many times that most of us simply accepted it as settled fact without ever questioning where the image actually came from. And it is, according to the actual medical records kept during the war itself, almost entirely wrong. Union records covering more than 80,000 surgical procedures show fewer than 300 performed without some form of anesthesia. Some historians researching the primary sources push that even higher, closer to 99% of every operation performed. Chloroform and ether, the very same substances that eased Fanny Longfellow through her labor in a quiet Cambridge bedroom back in 1847, have become standard equipment in an army surgeon's kit within less than 20 years, carried in specially designed cases alongside the bone saws and tourniquets. A surgeon would soak a small sponge, tuck it into a metal cone, and hold it gently over the wounded man's nose and mouth until his breathing slowed and his body went still. When witnesses described a wounded man groaning or thrashing during surgery, and there were witnesses who described exactly that, they were usually watching the ordinary physical reflexes of a body under fairly light anesthesia, not a man suffering fully conscious and aware. Doctors of the period sometimes deliberately kept patients in that lighter stage rather than pushing toward a deeper, riskier sleep, since a man who could still groan and twitch was, in a strange way, easier to monitor for safety than one who had gone completely silent. The phrase "bite the bullet" almost certainly grew out of a real practice. Biting down on something during the raw, disoriented minutes before anesthesia fully took hold, or while waking back up from it, rather than describing the surgery itself taking place with no relief at all. So why on earth were so many limbs removed in the first place, if the surgeons were not simply careless butchers? The honest answer sits in the weaponry, not the surgeons. A new type of ammunition called the mini ball, a soft lead bullet that expanded and deformed violently on impact, shattered bone into dozens of small fragments rather than passing cleanly through, as older, harder-round shot often had. Splintered bone of that kind, packed with dirt and fabric driven deep into the wound, had almost no realistic chance of healing on its own in an age before anyone understood that invisible bacteria, not bad air, caused infection. A surgeon standing over a shattered elbow or knee truly faced only two choices: take the limb quickly while the patient still had strength to survive the shock, or leave it and watch gangrene slowly claim the entire man over the following week. Amputation, brutal as it sounds to modern ears, was frequently the only procedure standing between a soldier and a slow, agonizing death from infection days later. Roughly 3 out of every 4 surgeries performed during the war were amputations, and a skilled surgeon could complete one in as little as 2 to 10 minutes. A grim kind of speed that at the time actually saved lives, rather than reflecting carelessness. Here is a small, strange, and completely true story I think about often. A Union general named Daniel Sickles had his right leg shattered by a cannonball at Gettysburg in July of 1863, while riding out to inspect his own position rather too near enemy lines. After the amputation, rather than letting the limb simply be discarded, Sickles had it packed carefully into a small coffin-shaped box and shipped it off to the newly founded Army Medical Museum in Washington, along with his own calling card reading, "With the compliments of Major General D. Sickles." For years afterward, on the anniversary of the amputation, Sickles would reportedly visit the museum himself to pay a quiet visit to his own leg bone, which, remarkably, is still on public display today, more than a century and a half later. Somewhere out there is a man who turned losing a limb into a lifelong personal tradition. And I have to admit, there is something almost endearing about the sheer stubbornness of that. Would you have kept visiting your own severed limb on display in a museum year after year? Or would you rather have never thought about it again? Not every amputee was quite so fortunate, of course. Survival dropped sharply the closer a wound sat to the body's core, since a surgeon working near the hip or shoulder had far less healthy tissue to work with and a much larger blood vessel to control. A Confederate general named John Bell had lost his leg high near the hip after the Battle of Chickamauga, a category of amputation so dangerous that British surgeons performing the identical procedure during an earlier war had watched every single one of their own patients die, without a single recorded survivor. Union surgeons, by contrast, managed roughly a 17% survival rate for that exact same operation. Grim odds by any modern standard. And Hood beat them, going on to survive for more than a decade afterward, commanding entire armies from horseback with an artificial leg strapped where his own had been. Small mercies measured against otherwise terrible statistics. Would you have consented to that surgery knowing the odds stacked against you? Or would you have gambled on the wound somehow healing itself instead? But here's the number that should actually reshape how you picture this entire war, more than any battlefield amputation ever could. For roughly every soldier killed by an enemy bullet or blade, about 2 more died from something that never came anywhere near a battlefield at all. Contaminated drinking water, drawn from streams sitting downhill from a camp's own latrines, spread dysentery and typhoid through crowded regiments faster than any cannon could ever manage. Union medical records alone logged well over 1.5 million cases of chronic diarrhea and dysentery in an army that never numbered much beyond 1 million men at any single point in the war. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly every soldier who served came down with it at least once, and for tens of thousands of them, a second or third bout eventually proved fatal. Camps that stayed in one location too long, latrines dug too near a drinking source, a single careless decision about where to pitch a tent could quietly kill more men over a single season than an entire pitched battle. Here is the detail I find worth sitting with, because it complicates the easy, comfortable story we usually tell about this particular war being some uniquely primitive medical disaster. Historians comparing casualty ratios across different conflicts found that for every Civil War soldier killed in combat, roughly 2 died of disease. That sounds catastrophic until you set it beside earlier wars for comparison. British soldiers fighting in the Napoleonic Wars decades earlier lost roughly 8 men to disease for every 1 lost in battle. During the Crimean War, fought only a handful of years before the American conflict, that ratio still sat at about 4-to-1. The American Army fighting in Mexico, barely more than a decade before its own Civil War, lost 7 men to disease for every 1 killed by an enemy soldier. Judged coldly by the numbers alone, the Civil War was not actually the worst war in this particular respect. It was strange as it feels to say out loud about a conflict remembered for its staggering death toll, something closer to a genuine improvement. Grim as that improvement still looks by any modern standard. Why the improvement specifically? A great deal of the credit belongs to one Union Army surgeon few people outside dedicated historians have ever heard of, A physician named Jonathan Letterman looked at the chaos following early battles. Wounded men left lying in fields for days with no organized way to reach them, and built something that had simply never existed before. A dedicated ambulance corps with trained stretcher bearers, designated wagons, and a clear system for sorting the wounded by how urgently they needed care. An idea we now call triage. By the time his methods were tested at Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, Union crews managed to evacuate more than 14,000 of their own wounded, along with nearly 7,000 Confederate wounded left behind on the same field, within roughly 3 days of the fighting ending. None of these men understood germs the way we do now, but Letterman and plenty of others working quietly alongside him had begun, through hard experience rather than any laboratory, to notice patterns worth acting on anyway, and to build systems around them that outlived the war itself by more than a century. Part of that improvement traces directly back to a British hospital nobody involved in the American War had ever personally set foot inside. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, a British nurse named Florence Nightingale arrived at a military hospital in Scutari to find conditions almost beyond description. Overflowing latrines, contaminated water, wounded men lying in the same filthy bedding for weeks at a time, waste reportedly flowing across the floor from plugged toilets that nobody had bothered to fix. The hospital's own death rate at its worst point reportedly climbed above 40% of everyone admitted. A hospital, in other words, that was killing more men than the actual fighting outside its walls. Nightingale, working alongside a sanitary commission sent out from London, tore into the building itself, improving ventilation, clean water, basic hygiene, and proper drainage, refusing to accept that dirty bandages and standing sewage were simply an unavoidable cost of war. Within roughly a year, that same death rate had fallen to somewhere around 2%. She then spent years afterward turning the raw numbers into detailed statistical charts, colorful wedge-shaped diagrams that made the human cost of poor sanitation impossible to misread at a glance. Some of the very first data visualizations ever used to argue for a public health policy determined that no government committee would ever again be able to politely ignore what dirty water and crowded wards actually cost in human lives. Here is the connective thread I find worth pausing on. In 1861, the same year the American Civil War began, Nightingale personally mailed her Crimean sanitary findings across the ocean to Dorothea Dix, the woman overseeing nursing for the entire Union Army, describing, in her own words, the sanitary evils of the Scutari hospitals, in the hope that the lessons might prove useful to someone facing the exact same crisis all over again. A war fought an ocean away, and a lesson paid for in thousands of preventable deaths, arrived just in time to help save at least some soldiers on an entirely different continent. Progress in this particular century traveled remarkably well by mail, even when it arrived several years too late for the men who had already paid for the lesson with their lives. America produced its own version of that same figure, working independently and largely without any formal medical training at all. A woman named Clara Barton simply showed up at field hospitals near the front lines, sometimes uncomfortably near active fighting, distributing supplies and nursing the wounded with her own hands until soldiers began calling her the angel of the battlefield. After the war ended, she spent years running an office dedicated to tracking down missing soldiers for grieving families, before eventually founding the American Red Cross itself in 1881. Neither Nightingale nor Barton waited for permission from the medical establishment of their day to start actually saving lives. They simply started, and the institutions eventually caught up to what they had already proven worked. I keep returning to one particular thought about this whole era of warfare. We tend to imagine the soldier's greatest enemy as the man standing across the field from him, rifle raised, bayonet fixed, near enough to see his face. For the overwhelming majority of men who actually died in this century's wars, the real enemy was invisible, drifting through drinking water, hiding in an overcrowded tent, waiting patiently in conditions that had absolutely nothing to do with courage or cowardice on either side of the battle line. A soldier could be the bravest man in his entire regiment and still lose everything to a stream he happened to camp beside. Here is a question worth sitting with before we move on. If you had to choose, knowing everything we now know, would you rather have faced a single dramatic battle with clear odds, or 6 quiet months in a crowded camp where the danger never announced itself at all? So if a soldier somehow survived the mini-ball, the amputation, and the dysentery that killed so many of the men standing right beside him, and made it home again in one piece, or nearly so, an entirely different kind of danger was often still waiting for him there. One with no battlefield at all, and no enemy uniform to identify it by. Because for the poorest of these returning men, veterans with missing limbs and no pension worth mentioning, and for countless others who had never worn a uniform in the first place, the next threat to survival was not a bullet, a fever, or a flooded mine shaft. It was simply the crushing, grinding weight of poverty itself, and the grim institution built specifically to manage the poor without ever quite being accused of actually helping them. That institution had a name, and it was designed, quite deliberately from its very first blueprint, to be a place nobody would ever want to walk into, unless every other option in their life had already run out completely. Tall walls, a single guarded entrance, a building deliberately built to look less like shelter and more like a warning visible from the street outside. In Britain, it was called the workhouse, and the law that shaped it, passed in 1834, rested on a single guiding idea that its own architects were remarkably candid about at the time. They called it the principle of less eligibility, a fairly dry bureaucratic phrase for something quite brutal underneath. Life inside the workhouse had to be made worse, deliberately and by design, than the life of the very worst paid laborer surviving outside it. Not equal worse. The reasoning went that if the workhouse ever became even slightly comfortable, people would supposedly stop bothering to work at all, and simply let the parish support them instead. An argument that assumed most poverty came down to simple laziness rather than illness, injury, widowhood, or the ordinary bad luck of being born in the wrong decade. So the men who wrote the law built cruelty into the blueprint on purpose, as a kind of policy tool, the same way you might design a fence specifically tall enough to keep people out. Here is what that principle actually meant for an ordinary family arriving at the door, desperate and out of other choices. Husbands were separated from wives. Parents were separated from children old enough to be judged capable of a little labor. Officials sorted every new arrival into one of several rigid categories. Elderly and infirm men in one wing, able-bodied men in another. Boys between roughly 7 and 13 kept apart from both. And an entirely parallel set of divisions for women and girls on the other side of the building. A family could walk in together and be split into entirely different wings of the same building within the hour. Sometimes never permitted so much as a shared meal again for as long as they remained inside. Husband and wife living under one roof, yet separated as completely as if an ocean sat between them. The able-bodied were set to grinding, repetitive tasks, picking apart old rope fiber by fiber for use in shipbuilding, a task called picking oakum that left fingers raw and bleeding by the end of a long shift, or breaking stones into gravel behind the workhouse walls for hours on end. There was a quieter penalty attached to all of this, too, one that had nothing to do with food or labor at all. Under British law, for most of this century, any man who accepted poor relief, workhouse or otherwise, automatically forfeited his right to vote. Old age, illness, or run of catastrophic bad luck, none of it mattered. The moment the parish stepped in to keep you alive, the law treated you as no longer fit to have a political voice in the country you lived in. It would take until 1918, well into the following century, before that particular disqualification was finally stripped out of the law entirely. Even homeless travelers who had no intention of staying in any one parish long enough to become a permanent burden were folded into this same grim machinery. Most workhouses kept a separate section, nicknamed the Spike by the people forced to use it, offering exactly one night of shelter and a meal to any wandering vagrant willing to perform a set task first, breaking a specified weight of stone or picking a set quantity of oakum, before being turned back out onto the road the following morning to walk toward the next parish and repeat the entire process all over again. Some unions demanded as little as 100 pounds of stone. Others demanded closer to 700. An inconsistency so glaring that even contemporary officials openly questioned whether the whole system amounted to much more than an exercise in arbitrary cruelty dressed up as policy. The diet, standardized by official government tables issued from London and applied with almost mathematical precision, sat at the very edge of what a human body could survive on. Thin gruel, morning and evening, a set ration of bread, perhaps 6 ounces of cheese across an entire week, meat only on certain specified days. All of it calculated by officials who sincerely believed they were being scientific and fair, keeping a person alive, and working without ever making that life pleasant enough to tempt anyone into staying a moment longer than necessary. There is something almost darkly comic about picturing a committee of well-fed gentlemen in London sitting around a table with quill pens, solemnly debating the precise number of ounces of cheese required to keep a starving family alive without accidentally making them comfortable. I doubt any of them ever tested the diet on themselves first. Would you have chosen the workhouse door, knowing everything it demanded of a family, if the only alternative was watching your own children slowly starve outside it instead? I suspect most of us like to imagine we would hold out with quiet dignity. I'm not entirely sure that is true, and I do not think it is a comfortable question to sit with for very long. Here is a real event I think illustrates the entire system better than any statistic could manage on its own. In August of 1845, in a town called Andover in the south of England, disturbing rumors began spreading about exactly what was happening in the workhouse yard, where inmates were assigned the grim task of crushing old animal bones into powder for fertilizer. The rumors turned out to be true. Starving men, given bones that were frequently rotten and sourced from slaughterhouse refuse, had begun secretly gnawing the scraps of marrow and gristle still clinging to them before crushing the rest, sometimes fighting each other outright over a particularly promising piece. A local guardian named Hugh Mundy, a farmer known locally for actually paying his own laborers a fair wage, brought the story to a sitting member of Parliament, a man named Thomas Wackley, who happened to also be a practicing physician and coroner, well positioned to recognize genuine institutional cruelty when he heard about it. Wackley raised the matter publicly, and an official investigation confirmed every uncomfortable detail. The workhouse master, a former Army sergeant named Colin McDougall, turned out to have been quietly shorting the inmates on their already meager official rations for years. While the local guardians responsible for regular inspections had not actually set foot inside the building since roughly 1840, leaving one domineering local official free to run the entire institution any way he pleased for the better part of 5 years. The scandal grew loud enough and embarrassing enough that when the central authority overseeing the entire system came up for its routine parliamentary renewal in 1847, lawmakers simply let it expire and replaced it outright with a new board answering directly to a sitting government minister. A rare instance of public shame actually producing structural change rather than a quiet apology and business as usual. Here is the detail that stops me every time I revisit this particular story. Roughly 7 years before the Andover scandal ever made a single newspaper headline, a novelist named Charles Dickens had already published a story about a starving orphan in a workhouse, timidly approaching the master after his portion of gruel ran out, and asking, in 4 words that have outlived nearly everything else written about this century, "Please, sir, I want some more." Readers at the time frequently treated that scene as satire and exaggeration for dramatic effect. Surely no real institution could actually be that petty and cruel over a single extra ladle of food. Then, within less than a decade, an actual government inquiry confirmed that starving men in an actual workhouse were doing something considerably more desperate than merely asking politely. Fiction in this particular case had not exaggerated reality by very much at all. If anything, it had been almost too restrained. I think it matters to know why Dickens wrote that scene with such conviction in the first place, because it was not simply an author's imagination reaching for a dramatic effect. When Dickens himself was only 12 years old, his own father was locked away in a London debtor's prison over an unpaid bill to a baker, and the family, unable to support themselves any other way, sent young Charles out to work 10-hour days in a rat-infested factory, pasting labels onto bottles of boot polish for a handful of shillings a week. He never fully spoke about that period for the rest of his life, and friends who eventually learned of it described him as visibly shaken decades later, simply recalling it out loud. The outrage running underneath Oliver Twist was not academic curiosity about poverty from a comfortable distance. It was a grown man writing in disguise about a version of his own childhood terror. Punishments inside these institutions, incidentally, were not reserved only for rule-breaking in any serious sense. Records from several workhouses across the country show inmates placed in solitary confinement on nothing but bread and water for offenses as minor as complaining about portion sizes, or simply asking out loud for a second helping. The exact same request that had made Dickens's fictional orphan famous in the first place. A grown man could find himself locked in a bare stone cell for the crime of being hungry and saying so. The gap between Dickens's fiction and the paperwork of an actual government inquiry had narrowed to almost nothing. And in some documented cases, the real punishments handed out for asking were considerably harsher than anything that happened to Oliver in the novel itself. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If a system is specifically engineered to be worse than the worst job available outside it, what does that tell you about how the people designing it actually viewed the poor they claimed to be helping? Across the ocean, America built its own version of this same basic idea, though with a distinctly different flavor to it. Rather than one centralized law dictating conditions nationwide, individual counties and towns ran their own poorhouses, sometimes called poor farms, where the elderly, the sick, the disabled, orphan children, and the mentally ill were frequently housed together under one roof, with far less of the rigid, deliberate classification the British system eventually attempted. Residents capable of any labor at all were expected to work the attached farmland to help offset the cost of keeping them, an arrangement local officials like to describe as teaching self-reliance, and which residents themselves more often simply experienced as unpaid farm work performed in exchange for a roof and a cot. Some counties, especially in the earlier decades of the century, even auctioned off the care of their poorest residents to whichever local farmer submitted the lowest bid, handing over an elderly widow or an orphan child to whoever promised to feed and house them most cheaply. A system that quietly rewarded neglect every bit as effectively as any workhouse rulebook ever managed on its own. One 19th century observer, writing about the dread these institutions inspired, noted that people would sooner risk starving quietly in their own homes than submit to what they considered the open shame of walking through a poorhouse door. The specific mechanism of cruelty differed slightly from one side of the Atlantic to the other. One centralized and coldly bureaucratic, the other scattered and locally run, occasionally kinder, occasionally considerably worse, depending entirely on which county you happen to fall ill in. The underlying message to the poor, that needing help was itself something near a moral failing deserving punishment, traveled remarkably well in both directions regardless. I keep returning to one particular thought while working through all of this material. We tend to assume that a society naturally becomes kinder to its most vulnerable members as it grows wealthier and more advanced. That comfort and compassion rise together on the same graph. The workhouse system stands as a fairly stubborn piece of evidence against that comfortable assumption. Britain by the 1830s was arguably the wealthiest, most industrially advanced nation the world had ever produced, sitting at the very center of a global empire. And it responded to poverty within its own borders by designing institutions explicitly engineered to be as miserable as the law could possibly make them. Wealth, it turns out, buys a nation the ability to build bigger, more efficient systems. It does not automatically buy kindness to go along with them. Here is one final question worth carrying with you. If you had to design a system to help the poorest people in your own country today, starting completely from scratch, would you build it around punishment, the way this century so often did? Or would you dare to build it around something closer to trust instead? So if a family survived their time inside those walls, eventually reunited, eventually released back into the world they had come from, they carried something with them that no amount of oakum picked or stones broken could ever quite undo. And their bodies, more often than not, carried something else too. The accumulated damage of a diet and environment, and a set of daily habits that an entire era's medicine had almost no real understanding of at all. Because if poverty was the century's punishment for simply falling behind, medicine itself, as practiced by the very people paid to heal you, was often not all that far removed from punishment either. Once you actually walked through the door of a doctor's office rather than a battlefield tent. And nowhere was that truer, or stranger, or occasionally more darkly funny in hindsight, than the moment you found yourself sitting in a chair, gripping the armrests, while a stranger reached toward your mouth holding nothing resembling modern comfort at all. Just a pair of pliers, a steady hand, and a set of remedies that, in more cases than any of us would like to admit, did considerably more harm than the toothache ever had. A toothache in this century was not a minor inconvenience you scheduled around a busy week. It was, for a great many people, one of the defining physical agonies of an entire lifetime. Something endured for weeks or months before anyone worked up the nerve to actually do something about it. And the person waiting to fix it was frequently not what you would call a medical professional in any sense we would recognize today. For most of the 1800s, dentistry simply was not a licensed, regulated profession the way medicine was slowly becoming. Anyone with a steady hand, a set of iron instruments, and enough confidence to advertise could hang out a shingle and call himself a dentist. Barbers had pulled teeth for centuries already, right alongside cutting hair and letting blood. A tradition old enough that the red and white stripes on a barber's pole actually trace back to bandages and blood from exactly this kind of work. Plenty of blacksmiths and traveling salesmen simply added tooth extraction to their existing trade, because the tools were not so different and the demand was constant. The instrument of choice was something called a tooth key, sometimes nicknamed a turnkey. A metal claw on a hinge that hooked around a rotten tooth and twisted it free of the jaw with a sharp turn of the wrist, very much the way you might use a key to force open a stubborn lock. It worked more often than you would expect. It also, with disturbing regularity, snapped teeth in half, tore into surrounding gum tissue, and occasionally fractured the jawbone itself when the tooth simply refused to give. There was no numbing agent worth mentioning, no sterilization of the instrument between patients, and often no waiting room beyond a line of people standing outside, listening to exactly what awaited them through a thin door. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the only dentist available to you worked out of the back of a wagon and used the exact same tools on your teeth as he used on horseshoes that same morning, would you have waited? Or would the pain have won out eventually? I want to bring one specific, very famous set of teeth into this story because the popular version of it has been wrong for roughly 2 centuries now. And the true version tells you far more about the era than the myth ever could. George Washington, the first president of the United States, is remembered in countless school books and cartoons as having worn wooden false teeth. He never did, not one set across his entire adult life. Historians now believe the myth likely grew out of the way ivory stains and discolors over time with regular use, taking on a grain and texture that, to later observers unfamiliar with the actual materials, simply looked like wood. What he actually wore, indentures crafted by a New York dentist named John Greenwood, was a startling mixture of materials. Hippopotamus ivory carved and shaped into a base, brass springs to hold the plates open, a base weighted with soft lead metal, and actual teeth. Some pulled from cattle, some from Washington's own mouth after they failed him, and, based on his own account books from 1784, at least 9 teeth purchased directly from enslaved people living on his own plantation for a sum of 122 shillings. We do not know, and likely never will, whether those particular individuals had any meaningful choice in that transaction at all, given the complete legal powerlessness of enslaved people at the time. It is one of those uncomfortable historical footnotes that resists a tidy, comfortable ending. Washington suffered from dental pain for essentially his entire adult life, losing his very first tooth at only 24 years old. And by the time he took the oath of office at 57, he had exactly one natural tooth remaining in his head. His ill-fitting dentures distorted his jaw, forced an uncomfortable, tight-lipped expression into most of his formal portraits, painters of the era learning to work carefully around it. And by most accounts, made both eating and public speaking a genuine daily struggle for the man leading an entire nation. The most powerful person in the country could not reliably bite into an apple without pain. And there was in that entire century not a single dentist alive who could have fixed it properly. Dentistry, uncomfortable as it was really only one small corner of a much larger philosophy running through nearly all of American and European medicine at the time. One historians now often call heroic medicine. A name that sounds complimentary until you learn what it actually meant in practice. The core idea was simple, and in hindsight almost entirely backward. Illness, doctors believed, came from an imbalance somewhere inside the body, an old idea stretching back to ancient theories about bodily fluids. And the correct response was to aggressively force that imbalance back out again, through bleeding, through vomiting, through violent purging of the bowels, sometimes all three within a single course of treatment for a single patient. The more dramatic and visible the reaction, the more convinced everyone became that the treatment was actually working. Some physicians of the era openly boasted about draining as much as 80% of a dying patient's total blood supply, treating a nearly empty vein as the mark of thorough, aggressive, high-quality care rather than a warning sign. Nowhere does that philosophy reveal itself more starkly than in the final hours of George Washington's own life. In December of 1799, Washington came down with a severe throat infection after riding out through freezing rain and snow to inspect his own farmland. A condition modern doctors believe was almost certainly acute epiglottitis, a swelling of the throat that can suffocate a person surprisingly quickly. He woke before dawn, barely able to breathe, struggling to speak, and sent for help immediately. His physicians, following the accepted medical wisdom of men like the prominent Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the actual signers of the Declaration of Independence and among the most influential physicians in the entire country, responded the only way heroic medicine knew how. They opened his veins and drained his blood repeatedly over the course of a single agonizing day. One bleeding session removing well over a dozen ounces at a time. By the time Washington finally died that evening, surrounded by his family at Mount Vernon, he had lost somewhere around 40% of his own blood, roughly 2.5 liters, and by several accounts, he himself kept requesting more bloodletting throughout the ordeal, trusting completely in a treatment that was very likely hastening his own death rather than preventing it. His final recorded words were reportedly simple and calm. "'Tis well,' he said, to have murmured as though satisfied with how thoroughly his doctors had tried. Would it change how you picture the death of a founding father, knowing that the treatment meant to save him may well have been the thing that finished him off? Bloodletting had a constant companion in nearly every physician's bag. A substance called calomel, made from mercury, prescribed constantly across the entire century for everything from constipation to fever to a simple upset stomach. Doses were rarely standardized, sometimes ranging from a tiny pinch to an amount that would be considered a dangerous overdose by any modern standard. Doctors watched for a very specific reaction after giving it: profuse, uncontrollable drooling from the mouth, and treated that drooling as proof the medicine was successfully purging whatever poison had made the patient sick in the first place. What was actually happening, of course, was mercury poisoning, slow and cumulative, sometimes severe enough to rot away the soft tissue of a patient's own cheeks and gums, occasionally loosening or destroying the very teeth that survived the tooth key and the turnkey in the first place, and in the worst documented cases, causing a condition doctors of the time simply called mercurial gangrene, where the tissue of the face itself began to die. This was not some fringe treatment reserved for the poor or the desperate. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark carried calomel with them across the entire continent on their famous expedition, dosing both their own men and Native Americans they encountered along the way. Abraham Lincoln reportedly took mercury pills known as blue mass for years to manage his moods. And some historians have wondered aloud whether the documented volatility of his temper during certain stretches of his life traces back, at least in part, to slow mercury poisoning rather than simple personality. The writer Louisa May Alcott, working as a Civil War nurse, was treated with calomel after contracting typhoid fever and later blamed the mercury itself for years of chronic health problems that followed her for the rest of her life. Even Clara Barton, the very same battlefield nurse who would go on to found the American Red Cross, took mercury doses of her own during that same war. An odd little detail that never seems to make it into the more heroic version of her story. I think what strikes me most about this entire chapter of medical history is not that these treatments failed. Plenty of medicine throughout human history has failed honestly through simple ignorance rather than malice. It is that failure itself was so often mistaken for proof of success. A drooling mouth, a violently emptied stomach, a body drained of nearly half its own blood. All of it was interpreted by intelligent, well-trained, sincerely well-intentioned men as unmistakable evidence that healing was actively underway. Confidence, it turns out, was never in short supply in this century. Actual evidence, the kind we would recognize today, very often was outside the doctor's office. An even less regulated industry was thriving, one built almost entirely on showmanship rather than medicine at all. Traveling salesmen crisscrossed the American frontier in brightly painted wagons, arriving in a new town with music, a bit of theater, and sometimes a small crowd of hired assistants planted among the audience to loudly praise the product before anyone else had even tried it. Selling bottled cures out of the back of a wagon and promising relief from every ailment imaginable in a single convenient purchase. One of the most successful, a self-described cowboy named Clark Stanley, built an entire brand around a public spectacle, slicing open living rattlesnakes in front of a gathered crowd at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, plunging them in boiling water, skimming the fat that rose to the surface, and bottling it on the spot as Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, while the astonished audience pressed forward to buy it. It sold for decades, marketed as a cure for arthritis, sore muscles, and practically anything else that ached. It made him a wealthy man, funding production facilities in 2 separate states. And when government investigators finally intercepted a shipment and tested a sample in 1916, following new food and drug regulations passed a decade earlier, they found precisely no snake oil in it whatsoever. Just mineral oil, a bit of beef fat, chili pepper, and turpentine. Stanley was fined a grand total of $20. A fairly cheap price for a fraud that had run quite successfully for the better part of a quarter century, and which left his very name permanently attached to the English language as shorthand for exactly this kind of confident, convincing nonsense. Here is a question I keep returning to myself. If a confident enough salesman, a dramatic enough performance, and a bottle with an appealing enough label could sell an entire nation on a product that did essentially nothing, what does that tell us about how much of medicine in this century was actually chemistry, and how much of it was simply theater performed convincingly enough to be believed? English even had a ready-made word waiting for men like Stanley, long before he ever bottled a drop of his liniment. Quack, borrowed from an old Dutch term for someone who loudly hawked salves and ointments in the market square. It has nothing whatsoever to do with ducks, whatever you may have assumed, though I will admit the two do share a certain talent for making a great deal of noise while producing very little of actual substance. It is worth noting in fairness that this was never purely an American problem, though the wide-open, sparsely regulated American frontier certainly gave it room to run further than it might have elsewhere. European medicine, particularly in cities with established universities and teaching hospitals, moved toward formal licensing and standardized training somewhat earlier and somewhat more consistently, with examinations, apprenticeships, and official governing bodies keeping at least the worst frauds further from respectable practice. But even there, physicians armed with genuine medical degrees and framed diplomas hanging proudly on the wall kept right on bleeding and purging their patients using the exact same heroic methods well into the middle of the century. Official credentials offering no real protection against a theory of the body that was simply fundamentally mistaken from the very foundation up. The diploma never automatically meant the treatment behind the door was any less dangerous than the one sold from the back of a painted wagon. So if a person somehow survived the dentist's tooth key, the physician's lancet, and the traveling salesman's rattlesnake showmanship all in the very same lifetime, they still faced one more judgment this century was fully prepared to hand down. One that had nothing to do with the body at all, and everything to do with what happened the moment their own mind began behaving in ways nobody around them was willing or able to understand. Because a broken tooth could be pulled, a fever could be bled, and a bad batch of medicine could eventually be exposed and fined. A mind that simply worked differently from everyone else's, grieving too loudly, seeing things nobody else could see, refusing to fit quietly into the role assigned to it, had no tooth key waiting to fix it, and precious few people in this century willing to even try. A mind that worked differently from everyone else's carried its own particular danger in this century. One that had almost nothing to do with medicine, and almost everything to do with who happened to be standing nearby when that difference became impossible to ignore, and whether that person had anything to gain from calling it madness. Here is what should truly unsettle you about the word insanity, as it was used in the 1800s. It was almost never a precise medical diagnosis arrived at through careful observation, laboratory tests, or any standard a modern psychiatrist would recognize as remotely rigorous. It was far more often whatever the most powerful person in a household or a courtroom decided it meant on any given afternoon for any given reason. Grief that lasted too long after a death. Opinions that clashed too sharply with a husband's or a father's. A woman who kept her nose in too many books, or not enough of the right kind, or simply refused to keep her voice down in a room full of men who preferred silence. Eccentricity, stubbornness, an inconvenient temper. Even ordinary menopause was, at various points across the century, seriously offered up in medical literature as a plausible cause of female insanity. Actual asylum admission records from both sides of the Atlantic list causes that sound, in hindsight, almost like a joke nobody involved realized they were making. Novel reading, religious excitement, and in at least one documented case, simply too much rigorous intellectual study. Any of it presented to the right doctor with enough confidence could be enough to have a door locked behind you. A Massachusetts woman named Dorothea Dix discovered exactly how far that flexibility could be stretched almost by accident, while volunteering to teach a Sunday class to female prisoners in a jail near Boston in 1841. Wandering through the building afterward, curious about a section she had never been shown, she found several mentally ill women locked in an unheated section of the jail alongside actual criminals, with no medical care of any kind, simply because nobody had anywhere else to put them. When she asked why the room had no stove or fire in the middle of a New England winter, the jailer reportedly told her that the insane did not feel the cold the way ordinary people did. An explanation she found so absurd and so revealing of exactly how little anyone had bothered to actually look that it changed the entire direction of the rest of her life. Dick spent the following 2 years methodically traveling the entire state of Massachusetts, visiting jails, almshouses, and asylums herself, taking careful, methodical notes on exactly what she witnessed in each one, town by town, cell by cell. In 1843, she brought her findings directly to the state legislature in a formal petition, and her own words from that document have survived, plain and devastating. She described inmates, in her own phrase, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. One entry in her notes described a woman kept locked in a cage. Another described a person confined to what she called a narrow, cramped stall for 17 straight years. The Massachusetts legislature, shaken, approved new funding almost immediately to expand the Worcester Asylum. Dix did not stop there. Over the following 4 decades, she carried the exact same investigation state by state, methodically working her way across nearly the entire country, and later parts of Europe, directly involved in establishing or expanding somewhere around 32 separate institutions across 15 states, meant to treat the mentally ill as patients rather than simply hide them away as an inconvenience. Even inside the newer, supposedly reformed institutions Dix helped bring into being, restraint remained a constant, uncomfortable fact of daily life. Straitjackets were common, so were leather wrist cuffs, and a device that became grimly famous under the name the Utica crib. A long wooden box, roughly the size of a child's bed, fitted with slatted sides and a hinged locking lid, inside which an agitated patient could be confined lying flat for hours, sometimes days, unable to sit up, unable to turn over, unable to do anything at all except wait. She accomplished all of this, worth noting, at a time when she herself could not vote, could not hold office, and had struggled with what she described in her own private letters as periods of deep depression throughout much of her adult life. An old, recurring illness that had once sent her to Europe simply to recover her own strength. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the person who did more than perhaps anyone else in the entire century to change how mentally ill people were treated had, by her own private admission, spent years privately fighting her own mind and never once used that struggle as an excuse to stop. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If the person most responsible for exposing this entire system had no political power of her own whatsoever, what does that suggest about how much raw, stubborn persistence it actually takes to change something everyone else has simply learned to look past? Even with Dix's reforms slowly spreading outward, the deeper problem sat somewhere else entirely. Not in the condition of the buildings, but in exactly who got to decide someone belonged inside one in the first place. In Illinois in 1860, a woman named Elizabeth Packard learned that lesson in the most personal way imaginable. Packard, a mother of 6 married to a Calvinist minister, had begun openly disagreeing with her husband's rigid religious teachings, questioning doctrine she found cruel, and voicing her own gentler interpretation of Scripture during a church class. Her husband, convinced this defiance was itself a symptom of madness, arranged for a doctor to visit their home disguised as a traveling sewing machine salesman, and used that visit as grounds to have her forcibly committed. By Packard's own written account, published years later, She awoke that June morning to find her husband approaching her bedroom, accompanied by the county sheriff. And when she locked her door in fear, he forced his way in through the window with an axe. Under Illinois law at the time, a husband needed no public hearing and no proof whatsoever to commit his own wife. An exception written directly into the statute for married women alone. Her signature on the matter was never required. His alone was sufficient. Packard spent 3 years inside the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville, refusing the entire time to simply agree that her own beliefs were symptoms of illness. A stubbornness many observers at the time apparently found more suspicious than reassuring. When she finally secured a jury trial in 1864, doctors and witnesses were called from both sides, and the jury needed only a matter of minutes of deliberation to declare her completely sane. By then, her husband had already sold their family home and left the state entirely with their younger children. And Illinois law gave Packard no real path to recover either the children or her own property. She spent the rest of her life campaigning for legal reform instead, publishing her own account of the ordeal and personally lobbying state legislatures across the country. Within her own lifetime, for separate states rewrote their commitment laws specifically because of the case she had forced into public view through nothing more than sheer patient persistence. Would you have trusted your own sanity to hold up under 3 years of being told, calmly and repeatedly, by people in positions of authority, that you were wrong about your own mind? It would be unfair, and honestly a little lazy, to paint every asylum built in this century as simple cruelty dressed up in a hospital's clothing. A Philadelphia physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride, trained partly among Quakers who believed even the most severely afflicted patient deserved genuine dignity, spent much of his career designing an entirely different kind of institution. Long, sunlit wings arranged to catch maximum daylight and fresh air. Spacious grounds for patients to walk and work outdoors. A philosophy he called moral treatment, built on rest, routine, decent food, and honest human respect, rather than chains and a locked cellar door. He published his design principles formally in 1854, and dozens of states, inspired by both his architectural plans and Dix's relentless advocacy, built exactly these kinds of hospitals across the middle decades of the century, sincerely believing, with real evidence behind them in many early cases, that a calm environment could help heal a troubled mind. The tragedy is that the very success of the idea became its undoing. As word spread that these new hospitals actually offered decent care, families sent more and more patients through their doors. Funding never quite kept pace with demand, and institutions built to comfortably house a few hundred souls in dignity slowly swelled into overcrowded warehouses holding thousands. Exactly the kind of place Nellie Bly would walk into and just barely walk back out of a few decades later. Roughly 2 decades later, in 1887, a young journalist working under the pen named Nellie Bly decided the only honest way to investigate conditions inside one of New York's most notorious asylums was to actually get herself committed to it. Her editor at the New York World gave her only 3 instructions before she began. Adopt a false name so the paper could track her. Report everything honestly, and stop smiling so much since it might give the whole act away. She spent days beforehand practicing a wide-eyed, unsettled expression in a mirror, checked into a boarding house under a false identity, stayed awake through the night, behaving erratically enough to alarm the other residents, and within a remarkably short span of time, found herself examined by 4 separate doctors, none of whom apparently asked more than a handful of cursory questions before pronouncing her insane and shipping her off to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. The institution, originally built to comfortably house around 1,000 patients, was crammed with more than 1,600 by the time she arrived. And once inside, she calmly dropped the performance entirely, behaving completely normally, only to discover that ordinary, calm behavior made no difference whatsoever to the diagnosis already stamped onto her file. For 10 days, Bly ate spoiled food, bathed in freezing water, shared among dozens of other women using the exact same tub and the exact same rag, and watched patients who showed no obvious signs of any mental illness at all slowly deteriorate simply from the crushing boredom and neglect of the place itself. Some of the women she met, by her own account, seemed entirely lucid and had apparently been committed for nothing more than a poor grasp of English or a foreign accent that confused an examining doctor. When her newspaper finally arranged her release and published her account as a serialized expose, the public reaction was immediate and furious. A grand jury investigation followed within weeks, and the city increased funding for asylum care almost overnight. A rare instance where the fastest path to genuine reform turned out to be one brave woman's willingness to be locked away and quietly counting the days until someone let her back out. I think what strikes me most, setting these three stories side by side, Dix's tireless investigation, Packard's stubborn survival, and Bly's deliberate performance, is how differently the exact same system treated women depending entirely on who was doing the looking and what that person needed the diagnosis to mean. Packard was punished for behaving exactly like herself, calmly, consistently, and without ever once wavering from her own honest beliefs. Bly, by contrast, was rewarded, celebrated even, for performing madness convincingly enough to fool four separate professional doctors within a matter of minutes. Somewhere in that uncomfortable gap sits an entire century's confused, contradictory relationship with the human mind. Confident enough to lock a woman away on nothing more than her own husband's signature, yet fooled almost instantly by a 23-year-old reporter armed with little more than a good mirror and steady nerves. Here is one last question worth carrying with you before we move on. How many people in your own life right now would you trust completely to decide on your behalf whether your own mind still belongs to you? So if a person managed to avoid the workhouse, survive the dentist's chair, and keep their own mind entirely their own, without a husband, a father, or a suspicious neighbor ever deciding otherwise, an entirely different danger was still quietly waiting in the water they drank every single day. One that made no distinction whatsoever between the sane and the supposedly mad, the rich and the poor, or the guilty and the entirely innocent. It did not need a signature, a doctor's opinion, or a jury's verdict to take someone. It simply needed a single contaminated well, a careless choice about where to dig a latrine, and enough time. And by the middle of this century, entire cities on both sides of the Atlantic were about to discover exactly how little time that actually took. That well, that pump, that ordinary source of drinking water sitting on an ordinary street corner carried a danger this century mostly failed to see coming. Because for most of the 1800s, almost everyone who studied disease was looking in entirely the wrong direction, confidently and with the very best of intentions. Cholera itself deserves a moment of honest description, because the word alone does not quite capture how brutally fast this disease actually worked. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead before nightfall. The illness draining the body of fluid so violently through vomiting and diarrhea that victims sometimes lost a significant portion of their own body weight within hours. Their skin turning a strange bluish gray as the blood itself thickened and slowed. Eyes sinking back into the skull in a way that horrified even experienced physicians who had already seen a great deal of death by that point in their careers. Doctors of the era, watching a healthy neighbor collapse and die within a single day, understandably reached for the most dramatic explanation available to them. Poisoned air, rather than the far less visible, and in some ways far more mundane truth, sitting quietly in the family's own drinking cup. The dominant medical theory of the age held that disease traveled through bad air, a poisonous, invisible fog rising from filth, rot, and standing water, which physicians called miasma. It sounds almost quaint now, but it shaped nearly every public health decision of the century. Cities built their sewers to carry waste away from noses rather than away from drinking water. Doctors advised patients to avoid unpleasant smells rather than unclean water. An entire century's worth of civic planning was silently built on a theory that happened to be, in its specific mechanism, completely wrong, even while it accidentally pushed cities toward truly useful reforms. Simply because clean-smelling places and clean water sources tended, by pure coincidence, to overlap rather often. One London physician refused to accept the theory at face value, and his story deserves a more honest telling than the tidy, triumphant version you may have already heard. John Snow had actually published his waterborne theory of cholera 5 years earlier, in 1849, after noticing that neighborhoods supplied by one particular water company suffered far worse infection rates than neighborhoods served by another. But the medical establishment had largely shrugged the paper off. In 1854, a severe cholera outbreak tore through the Soho district of London, killing roughly 600 people within about 10 days in an area centered around Broad Street. Snow, still convinced of his earlier theory, began collecting the addresses of the dead himself, walking door to door through the neighborhood and interviewing grieving families about their daily habits, where they drew their water, what they ate, who in the household had fallen ill first. The pattern that emerged pointed again and again toward a single public water pump on Broad Street. Snow brought his findings to local officials and convinced them to remove the pump's handle, physically disabling it. Here is where the popular version of this story tends to get a little carried away with itself. And I think the true version is actually more interesting anyway. By the time officials finally agreed to remove that handle on the 7th of September, the outbreak had already been declining for several days on its own, most of the surrounding residents having already fled the area or already died. The famous map most people picture, the one showing black bars stacked up like tiny gravestones along Broad Street, was not even finished until months afterward, used to argue the case retroactively to a skeptical medical community rather than to solve the outbreak in real time as it was still happening. Removing the pump handle did not single-handedly end the outbreak. Whatever the popular legend repeated in classrooms and documentaries for well over a century now would prefer you to believe. What actually mattered was something quieter and honestly more impressive than one dramatic gesture with a wrench. Snow's patient, methodical detective work, matching individual deaths to individual water sources, comparing infection rates between neighborhoods served by different water companies, tracking down cases that seemed to contradict his theory and explaining each one carefully rather than simply ignoring the inconvenient data, built a body of evidence detailed enough that it eventually became almost impossible to keep dismissing. It simply took decades, not days, for the medical establishment to actually come around. Snow himself died of a stroke in 1858, only 4 years after Broad Street, never living to see the day, roughly a quarter century later, when a German scientist named Robert Koch would finally isolate the actual cholera bacterium under a microscope and give Snow's waterborne theory the hard scientific proof it had always deserved, but never quite received while its own author still walked the earth to enjoy it. An Italian anatomist named Filippo Pacini, oddly enough, had already spotted that same bacterium under his own microscope back in 1854, the very same year as the Broad Street outbreak, and published his findings too, only to be almost completely ignored by the wider scientific world for nearly 30 years. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many correct ideas throughout history do you suppose got quietly ignored for years? Not because the evidence was weak, but simply because the person presenting it lacked the right title, the right connections, or enough patience left to keep repeating himself. Across the ocean, American cities were learning identical lessons on their own painful schedule, entirely independent of anything happening in London. Cholera swept through New York City 3 separate times in a single generation, in 1832, 1849, and 1866. And the death tolls tell their own quiet story of progress, slow as that progress was. The first outbreak killed somewhere around 3,500 New Yorkers out of a city of only about 250,000 people. A proportion of the population that, translated into a modern city the size of today's New York, would mean well over 100,000 deaths in a single summer. Wealthy residents who could afford to simply fled to the countryside the moment word of the outbreak spread, leaving the poor, who had nowhere else to go, to face the worst of it alone. The second outbreak, 17 years later, killed more than 5,000 New Yorkers. Its origin later traced with unusual precision to a single filthy, lightless cellar dwelling on Baxter Street, one of roughly 29,000 basement rooms crammed with poor families across the city at the time. Damp, airless, and sitting well below street level where wastewater naturally pooled. By the third outbreak in 1866, with the city's population having grown enormously in the meantime, a newly formed Metropolitan Board of Health moved swiftly with organized sanitary inspections, mandatory cleanup orders, and quarantine measures the moment the disease was first detected arriving by ship, rather than waiting for it to spread unchecked through the tenements first. The death toll dropped to just over 1,100, a genuine, measurable improvement brought about specifically because officials had finally started acting on Snow's own findings from across the ocean. Even though every single one of those 1,100 deaths remained, of course, entirely real and entirely devastating to the families standing at the graveside. Would knowing that history was steadily repeating itself 3 times over in the very same city change how patiently you would have waited for officials to finally take the problem seriously? There was also, running underneath all of this scientific confusion, an uglier assumption that shaped who received sympathy and who received blame. Doctors and moralists on both sides of the Atlantic frequently insisted that cholera preferred victims who were, in their own preferred language, intemperate, imprudent, and filthy, treating a bacterial infection as though it were somehow a referendum on a person's character. When the disease appeared almost exclusively in crowded, poor neighborhoods, that pattern was interpreted not as evidence of contaminated shared water sources, but as confirmation that poverty itself was simply an unclean, morally suspect way of living. It took the disease actually reaching a few respectable, well-to-do households before public opinion started slowly and reluctantly to separate the germ from the moral judgment riding alongside it. Would you have believed, if you had been standing in a fashionable drawing room in 1850, that a disease supposedly caused by sin could somehow still manage to find its way in through the very same water pipes everyone in the neighborhood happened to share? Sometimes, though, it took something far less scientific than careful data collection to finally force a government's hand. And London offers up one of the more darkly comic examples in the entire history of public health, if you can allow yourself to laugh at a crisis this smelly. In the summer of 1858, an unusually hot spell baked decades of raw sewage sitting along the banks of the River Thames, producing a stench so overwhelming that it became known, quite literally, as the Great Stink. Members of Parliament, whose newly rebuilt building sat directly beside the river, tried soaking curtains in chemical lime to mask the odor. It did not work. One frustrated lawmaker, the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, reportedly described the river outside the window as a Stygian pool, borrowing the name of the mythical river separating the living from the dead, which feels like exactly the kind of overly dramatic complaint you would expect from a group of powerful men suddenly forced to smell the same thing the poor had been smelling for decades. Serious proposals were floated to relocate the entire government somewhere upwind entirely. Newspapers mocked the lawmakers mercilessly for tolerating conditions that had already been quietly killing the poor for decades, yet somehow only became an emergency the moment it reached Parliament's own windows. Within a startling 18 days of that realization, considerably faster than Parliament typically managed to agree on anything at all, a bill authorizing a completely new sewer system for the city passed into law. The engineer given the job, a man named Joseph Bazalgette, spent the following years constructing more than 80 miles of brick-lined intercepting tunnels beneath the city. An engineering effort on a scale London had never once attempted before, carrying waste well away from both drinking water and Parliament's increasingly sensitive nose alike, pumped out toward the sea by steam-powered engines, rather than left to simply drift with the tide back into the very neighborhoods it had come from. Cholera rates in London fell dramatically in the years that followed, not because anyone in power had finally accepted Snow's waterborne theory. Most officials still blamed the smell itself right up through the completion of the project, but because building infrastructure to solve a smell problem happened to also solve a water contamination problem at the very same time. Occasionally in this century, the right solution arrived attached to entirely the wrong explanation, and nobody involved seemed to mind, so long as the smell finally went away. I keep coming back to how strange that particular irony really is. An entire sewer system, one that silently saved untold thousands of lives from waterborne disease for generations afterward, got built because a group of powerful men found a bad smell personally intolerable. Not because anyone in charge had actually accepted the correct science behind why people were dying. Good outcomes, it turns out, do not always require anyone involved to actually understand why they worked. And sometimes the most effective argument for public health was never careful data at all. It was simply making the suffering of the poor smell bad enough, near enough to the right windows, that the people with actual power could no longer pretend not to notice it. Would an outbreak in your own city have to reach your own doorstep, quite literally, before you demanded anyone in charge actually do something meaningful about it? It is an uncomfortable question, because history rather strongly suggests the honest answer for most people in power throughout this century was yes. So if a family somehow avoided the workhouse, the asylum, and the cholera riding quietly through the city's own water supply, all in the very same lifetime, there was still one more test this century had waiting specifically for those who had nothing left to lose at home. Because for millions of people across Europe in these same decades, the honest calculation was not whether life at home was comfortable. It was whether staying meant a slow, certain decline, or whether the long, uncertain voyage across an entire ocean toward a country that had already made them all sorts of promises it had absolutely no intention of keeping in full might somehow still work out to be the safer bet. That promise, the one printed on shipping company posters and repeated by hopeful neighbors who had already made the crossing, rarely mentioned the 6 to 8 weeks that stood between a person's old life and whatever waited on the other side of an entire ocean. Those same posters, it is worth noting, were masterpieces of selective honesty, promising fast, comfortable passage and bountiful opportunity waiting at the other end, while silently saying absolutely nothing at all about lice, typhus, or the very real chance of watching a fellow passenger buried at sea before the voyage even reached its halfway point. If truth in advertising had existed as a concept back then, an enormous number of these posters would have needed a great deal more fine print and a considerably smaller typeface for the word paradise. Let me set the scene honestly, because the word coffin ship gets thrown around so casually now that it has almost lost its weight. In the mid-1840s, a blight destroyed the potato crop across Ireland, the single staple that an enormous portion of the rural population depended on for nearly every calorie they ate. Starvation followed within months. Then disease followed soon after, and by the back half of the decade, hundreds of thousands of desperate people were doing the only thing that still seemed to offer any hope at all: buying the cheapest possible ticket on the cheapest possible ship bound for Canada or the United States, often with nothing left to lose, because they had already lost essentially everything worth losing at home. This was not some isolated Irish story sealed off from everything else we've already discussed. The same workhouse system, the same principle of making relief deliberately punishing that we spent time with earlier in this very story, operated across Ireland too, under the exact same law administered by the exact same distant government, and it utterly failed to keep pace with a catastrophe of this scale. Here is a detail worth sitting with before we go any further. Under a piece of legislation nicknamed the Gregory Clause, added to Ireland's own poor relief law in 1847, anyone holding more than a quarter acre of land was disqualified from receiving public assistance entirely. Families desperate enough to need help were forced to formally surrender whatever small plot of land they still owned just to qualify for the barest minimum of relief. A policy that, whether intentionally or not, actively pushed struggling tenant farmers off the very land that might otherwise have let them eventually recover once the blight finally passed. It meant that even families who somehow survived the famine itself often had nothing left to actually return to afterward. No farm, no lease, no foothold of any kind on the only country they had ever known. For a great many of them, boarding a ship was not really a choice between two options. It was the only door still standing, and someone in London had quietly helped lock all the others. The ships themselves were, by any honest measure, appalling. Ship owners were legally required to provide only the barest minimum of food, water, and space per passenger, and a fair number ignored even that. Passengers were packed into the ship's hold, often with less space per person than a modern coffin, hence the grim nickname that stuck to the worst of these vessels. Typhus, spread by lice thriving in unwashed clothing and unwashed bodies crammed together for weeks on end, tore through the crowded holds with terrifying speed. A disease Irish passengers themselves came to call ship fever. A man who kept a diary aboard one such vessel, writing under the name Robert White, described passengers aboard his own ship dressing carefully in their finest clothes as they finally approached the Canadian coast, hoping to look presentable and healthy enough to be waved straight through to Quebec rather than held back in quarantine, only to watch an inspecting doctor glance briefly over the railing, decide nothing, and simply sail away again for days, leaving them anchored and waiting with the sick and the dying still packed in below. Mortality figures from this period truly vary, depending on which record you trust and which single year you happen to be looking at. And I think the honest, complicated version of this story matters more than a single tidy statistic. Careful records kept by one Irish-born immigration officer in Canada, tracking every single ship bound for Quebec in the terrible year of 1847, show that just under 11% of those who set out died, either at sea or in quarantine shortly after arrival. A horrifying number on its own, and yet still lower than the wildly popular claim that a full fifth of all immigrants perished. That figure also only applies to that single catastrophic year. In calmer years, just before and after, mortality on the very same crossing sometimes dropped below 1%, closer to the ordinary risk of any long sea voyage in this era. What that broader average conceals, though, is that individual ships suffered catastrophically worse fates than the numbers alone suggest. The Ajax left Dublin in the late spring of 1847, carrying just over 100 passengers, and lost roughly half of them before ever reaching land. The Agnes carried 427 passengers to the Canadian quarantine station and delivered barely 150 of them alive. A single bad captain, a single overcrowded hold, or simply a single unlucky outbreak that started early in the voyage rather than late, could turn an ordinary crossing into a genuine catastrophe almost entirely by chance. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you were told honestly and in advance that your particular ship had roughly the same odds of survival as a coin flip, would hunger and hopelessness at home still have been enough to send you walking up that gangplank anyway? The place where so many of these ships eventually stop tells its own quiet story. An island in Canada's St. Lawrence River called Gros Isle had already served as a quarantine station for over a decade by the time the famine hit its worst point. But nothing had prepared it for what arrived in the spring and summer of 1847. A year Irish memory still simply calls Black 47. On a single day at the end of May that year, 40 separate ships lay anchored off the island at once, carrying somewhere around 12,500 passengers between them. far more sick and dying people than the island's small hospital could possibly handle. Healthy passengers, forced to wait their turn for inspection, sometimes sat anchored within sight of the island for days at a stretch, watching smaller boats ferry the dead ashore for burial, while they themselves had nowhere left to go but wait and hope their own turn never came. One anonymous passenger aboard a ship called the Virginius, which arrived that same terrible season, having already lost over 150 of its own passengers at sea, described conditions below deck as something resembling a floating hell. The living forced to sleep pressed directly against the dying, with nowhere else left to lie down. More than 5,000 people are believed to be buried in the cemetery on that small island today. Most of them never having set one living foot on the mainland they had risked absolutely everything to reach. Would you have been able to keep any faith at all in the promise of a better life, standing on the deck of a ship anchored within sight of that same island, watching still more bodies quietly carried off toward yet another mass grave? For those who did survive the crossing and finally reached American shores, the welcome waiting for them was, for decades, essentially no welcome at all. Before 1855, the United States had no formal immigration processing system whatsoever. Exhausted, seasick travelers simply stepped off the ship directly into whatever chaos happened to be waiting on the dock. And that chaos very often included con artists and thieves who specialized entirely in preying on newcomers too disoriented and too unfamiliar with American money to recognize when they were being cheated. A New York facility called Castle Garden finally opened its doors in 1855 specifically to fix this problem, offering new arrivals a place to register, exchange currency at an honest rate, and find legitimate work rather than immediately falling prey to the predators lurking just outside its gates. Over the following 35 years, before Ellis Island eventually took over the job in the 1890s, Castle Garden processed somewhere around 8 million new arrivals. So many that Yiddish-speaking immigrants coined their own slang term for it, Kesselgaden, meaning any place that felt loud, chaotic, and thoroughly overwhelming. A small linguistic joke born directly out of that very first bewildering day in a brand new country. Even those who cleared Castle Garden successfully still faced open, printed hostility in the job market waiting beyond its doors. American newspapers of the period regularly carried help-wanted advertisements bluntly stating that Irish applicants need not bother applying at all. A phrase common enough in print that it eventually inspired its own popular song. Historians still argue today over exactly how common the physical version of that same message, a sign posted directly in a shop window, actually was on American streets. But the printed advertisements themselves are a matter of settled historical record, sitting undisturbed in newspaper archives for anyone who cares to look. There is one thread running through this same tragedy worth pulling out separately because it complicates the story in a way I find truly moving. Somewhere around 700 children were formally recorded as orphaned at Grosse Isle and the surrounding region during that single terrible year, having lost both parents either at sea or in the fever sheds crowding the island itself. A great many of these children were quietly taken in by French-Canadian Catholic families living in the surrounding countryside, given new names, a new language, and a new home. Not always purely out of charity. Historians studying the surviving adoption records note that an extra pair of working hands on a farm carried its own practical value too. But taken in all the same, some of their descendants, scattered across Quebec today, can still trace a direct line back to a single desperate summer on that small quarantine island. One small, complicated thread of genuine kindness woven into an otherwise devastating story. I think what stays with me most about this entire chapter is the sheer scale of the gamble involved, weighed against how little anyone actually knew about the odds before committing to it completely. Nobody boarding a coffin ship in 1847 had access to careful mortality statistics the way we do now, sitting comfortably a century and a half removed from the decision, able to look up exact percentages in a matter of seconds. They had rumor, desperation, and a printed promise from a shipping company that had every financial incentive to understate exactly how dangerous the voyage they were selling actually was. A ticket agent back in an Irish village was, after all, simply another salesman with a product to move. Not so very different from the traveling medicine sellers we spent time with earlier. Except the product this time was passage across an entire ocean, and the potential cost of a false promise was measured in human lives rather than a few wasted coins. Here is one last question worth carrying with you. Knowing everything we now know about the real odds involved, do you think fewer people would actually have made that same desperate choice? Or does genuine desperation simply refuse to be talked out of hope, no matter how honestly the risks are laid out in front of it? So if a family somehow survived the crossing, survived the quarantine island, and made it through Castle Garden's gates into an unfamiliar city that did not particularly want them there, an entirely different set of rules was waiting to greet them. Ones written not by any government at all, but by whichever judge, jury, or angry mob happened to decide that a stranger, a debtor, or simply someone unlucky enough to be poor in the wrong place at the wrong moment deserved whatever punishment this century felt like handing out. Because arriving safely, it turns out, was never quite the same thing as arriving welcome. And the laws waiting on the other side of that gangplank could prove every bit as unforgiving as the ocean these families had just spent 6 long weeks trying to survive. Those laws, the ones waiting quietly on the other side of every gangplank, every workhouse gate, every dark city street corner we've wandered through together tonight, were for most of this century breathtakingly disproportionate to the crimes they claimed to be punishing, and enforced with a strange, almost arbitrary unevenness that depended less on what you had actually done than on who happened to be judging you that particular morning. In Britain, for most of the 1700s and well into the 1800s, a sprawling collection of statutes historians later nicknamed the Bloody Code stretched the number of crimes technically punishable by death past 200 separate offenses. Not 200 versions of murder, 200 entirely different acts. Many of them almost comically minor by any modern standard. Destroying a fish pond, stealing from a rabbit warren, damaging a turnpike road, cutting down a young tree that did not belong to you, concealing the body of a stillborn child, often done by a terrified, grieving young mother rather than any calculating criminal. A person, in certain documented cases, could be legally hanged for stealing a saucepan, a length of ribbon, or a single loaf of bread. While, in one of the more truly bizarre quirks buried inside this legal patchwork, the outright kidnapping of a child was not formally classified as a crime at all under the same statutes. Each of these offenses had, in a sense, its own separate law, passed at its own separate moment, patched together over more than a century by a parliament reacting piecemeal to whatever crime happened to be alarming property owners at the time, rather than sitting down and designing anything resembling a coherent, proportionate system from the very beginning. The law's own internal logic, once you actually examine it closely, made even less sense the deeper you dug. Stealing goods from a shop while somebody happened to witness the act was typically punished with transportation, a forced, one-way voyage to a distant penal colony on the far side of the world, most commonly Australia, from which almost nobody ever found the means to return home again. Stealing those exact same goods without anyone seeing you do it was, under a different statute entirely, a hanging offense. Consider that for a moment. The law cared less about what you actually took than about whether you had been clever enough not to get caught taking it, effectively rewarding a thief for being observed and punishing one most severely for being skilled enough to go unnoticed. Between the late 1700s and the 1860s, roughly 160,000 men, women, and children were shipped off to Australian penal colonies this way. Many of them convicted of offenses that, stripped of the century's own peculiar legal reasoning, amounted to little more than desperate, ordinary theft. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment. If your own harshest possible sentence for stealing food to feed your family was a one-way voyage to the opposite side of the entire planet, with no realistic hope of ever seeing your home country again, would that possibility have stopped you? Or would hunger simply have made the decision for you regardless? Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If the law truly believed public execution deterred crime, how do you explain the documented report from a single day in 1815 when constables recorded 89 separate cases of pickpocketing happening in the very crowd that had gathered specifically to watch a public hanging? That detail alone tells you almost everything you need to know about whether the bloody code actually worked as intended. It did not. Crime rates stayed stubbornly high throughout the entire period, and reform-minded lawmakers slowly began chipping away at the list, starting with a determined member of parliament named Samuel Romilly in the early years of the century. In January of 1813, Romilly introduced a bill simply asking that stealing goods worth 5 shillings from a shop no longer carry a death sentence. The House of Lords rejected it outright. Romilly spent years afterward fighting the exact same uphill battle, one narrow, deeply unpopular proposal at a time, and died in 1818 without ever seeing the wholesale reform he had spent his career pushing for. Other reformers picked up where he left off. Progress, once it finally began arriving in earnest, moved in fits and starts. An 1823 law made the death penalty merely discretionary rather than mandatory for most remaining offenses. Robert Peel, serving as Home Secretary through the 1830s, pushed through a long series of further reforms, steadily removing sheep stealing, cattle stealing, forgery, and eventually arson and burglary from the list of hanging crimes, one statute at a time, year after painstaking year. By 1861, the number of capital offenses in Britain had fallen from over 200 down to just 5. Would you have had the patience for that kind of reform? Watching it crawl forward one narrow, hard-fought vote at a time, knowing that every year of delay meant more people hanged for crimes that everyone quietly already understood were absurdly punished? I am not sure I would have. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being right about something for years and watching almost nobody with actual power agree with you. And I think it deserves more sympathy than history usually grants it. America carried its own particular strain of this same disproportionate justice, one that had nothing to do with theft at all. For much of the early part of the century, a person could be locked away indefinitely simply for owing money they truly could not pay, regardless of whether the debt itself amounted to a small fortune, or, in some documented cases, barely a single dollar. The logic behind debtor's prison was, on its face, almost as backward as anything found in the bloody code. Locking a poor man away guaranteed, with mathematical certainty, that he could never actually earn the money needed to pay off what he owed in the first place. A paradox New York's own legislature openly acknowledged as early as 1732, decades before anyone worked up the political will to actually change it. Congress finally abolished the practice at the federal level in 1833, and individual states gradually followed suit over the next several decades, one legislature at a time. In roughly the same slow, uneven fashion, Parliament had chipped away at its own list of hanging offenses across the ocean. That same uneven, hard-fought pace toward decency showed up again in an entirely different form. This time built less around the gallows and more around a bold new idea that a criminal's mind, not merely his body, could actually be reformed. In 1829, a massive new prison opened on the outskirts of Philadelphia called Eastern State Penitentiary. Funded and championed largely by Quaker reformers who believed with real sincerity that total isolation, silent reflection, and honest penitence could turn a criminal into a truly changed person. The very word penitentiary comes directly from that belief. Prisoners were held completely alone in individual cells, remarkably advanced for the era, each fitted with running water, central heating, and its own small private exercise yard, kept almost entirely separate from any other human contact for months or sometimes years at a stretch. The first prisoner ever admitted, an 18-year-old farmer named Charles Williams, was led hooded into his cell so that he would not even be able to learn the layout of the building around him. Sentenced to 2 years of near-total silence for stealing a gold watch, a gold seal, and a single gold coin, goods worth altogether somewhere around $25. At the time, this was considered a truly progressive step forward and an explicit rejection of whipping posts, branding irons, and public humiliation as the primary tools of justice. The building itself, radiating outward from a central watchtower in 7 long spokes, became so famous that it drew architectural visitors from across the world, and something near 300 prisons on 4 separate continents eventually copied its basic design. The reaction to this bold experiment split almost immediately along fascinating lines. The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville toured the prison in 1832 and came away sincerely impressed, later writing that he could imagine nothing more powerful for genuine reformation than solitude, believing it could guide a prisoner through quiet reflection toward real remorse. A decade later, Charles Dickens, the very same novelist whose fictional orphan we spent time with earlier tonight, toured the same building during his own visit to America and reached the exact